Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been sitting on this experience for 16 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was back in September 2007 when me and my two buddies, Derek and Lewis, decided to do a multi-day backpacking trip in a pretty isolated part of the North Cascades. I'd done plenty of weekend hikes before, but this was supposed to be a 5-day trek through some really beautiful country. We were all experienced hikers, had all the right gear, and had been planning this trip for months. The first day went exactly as planned. Perfect hiking weather, not too hot, clear skies. We covered about 12 miles, saw some incredible views, took a bunch of photos, and were feeling great about the whole thing. We found a nice spot to camp that first night near a small stream, cooked some freeze-dried meals, and crashed pretty early. Nothing unusual at all. Day 2 started just as good. We packed up, hiked another 10 miles or so through some rougher terrain, and by late afternoon were looking for a spot to set up for the night. That's when we found what seemed like the perfect campsite. This flat shelf on the side of a mountain with a cluster of big boulders that would break the wind. It overlooked this deep ravine, and the view was incredible. We hadn't seen another soul all day, which was exactly what we wanted, just us and nature. We set up our 2 tents. I was sharing with Lewis and Derek had his own, got a small fire going and cooked dinner. We sat around bullshitting about work and life for a few hours and eventually started getting ready for bed around 10 o'clock. That's when everything changed. I was just about to crawl into the tent when I heard this movement. Not like a squirrel or some small animal. This was heavy, deliberate. It was coming from beyond the ridgeline above our camp. You could hear branches snapping, not little twigs, but actual branches, and these really distinct footfalls. 2-footed footfalls, like something walking on 2 legs, but way heavier than a person. "You guys hear that?" I asked. Lewis and Derek both nodded, looking up toward the ridge. "Probably just a bear," Derek said, but he didn't sound convinced. We'd all been in bear country before, and this didn't move like a bear. We decided to get in our tents anyway, figuring whatever it was would move on once it realized we were there. We kept talking for a while, but in hushed voices now. The sound stopped after about 20 minutes, and I started to relax a bit. Maybe it was just a bear after all, and it had moved on. I was almost asleep when it happened. It was right around midnight. I remember checking my watch. This scream. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a cougar. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard in my life. It was this powerful primal sound that seemed to come from the trees directly above our camp. It was almost like a roar, but with this high-pitched quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. It echoed through the ravine, bouncing back at us like it was coming from all directions. "What the fuck was that?" Lewis whispered, now fully awake beside me. Before I could answer, something hit the side of our tent. Then another thing, and another. Someone or something was throwing rocks and branches into our campsite, not just tossing them, hurling them with force. We could hear them hitting the ground, our tents, the boulders around us. This went on for over 30 minutes. I'm not exaggerating. Half an hour of something deliberately throwing stuff at our camp. We were frozen in our tents, barely breathing, definitely not talking. I had my pocket knife clutched in my hand, though what good that would have done against whatever was out there, I don't know. Then it got worse. The throwing stopped, but we could hear heavy movement again, this time circling behind our position, down toward the ravine side of our camp. There was this deep, guttural grunting as it moved through the brush. Not like pig grunts, more like a person trying to clear their throat, but deeper, more animal, And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It hit us all at once, this foul, rotting odor that was like a mix of wet dog and decaying meat. So strong it made my eyes water. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different. It had this musty, unwashed quality to it too, and it was just everywhere, like it had soaked into the fabric of our tents. "What do we do?" Lewis whispered, so quiet I could barely hear him. "Nothing," I whispered back. "We stay put. We don't make noise. We wait for morning." The whole night went on like this. Periods of silence broken by sounds of movement, branches breaking. Then this rhythmic pacing back and forth at the edge of our camp, like it was patrolling. Every once in a while, we'd hear that throat-clearing grunt again. Sometimes there would be this deep, almost subsonic rumbling that you felt more than heard. I don't think any of us slept a single minute. We just lay there, listening, terrified to make any noise. I kept checking my watch, watching the minutes crawl by. Around 3:30 in the morning, Derek whispered over to us from his tent. "Guys, it's right there," he said, his voice shaking. "I can see it through the tent." My stomach dropped. Derek's tent was about 10 feet from ours. His was a different design with a small mesh window on the side that had a rain flap you could unzip. "What do you see?" I whispered back. There was a long pause before he answered. "It's fucking huge," he finally said. "At least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It's covered in this thick, shaggy, dark hair, long arms. It's not standing straight up, kind of hunched over. It's sniffing the air." Lewis and I were completely still, barely breathing. I wanted to see it, but at the same time, I absolutely did not want to see it. "It's moving," Derek whispered after what seemed like an eternity. "Going back into the trees. Holy shit, it moves fast. Like, way too graceful for something that big." Then silence again. The pacing stopped, the grunting stopped, but the smell lingered. We stayed completely still until the first hint of dawn started to lighten the sky. None of us said a word. I think we were afraid that speaking might somehow bring it back. When it was finally light enough to see, we cautiously unzipped our tents and looked out. Our camp was a mess. Twigs and small branches were scattered everywhere. One of the rocks we'd used to build our fire ring had been moved about 15 feet away. But the most disturbing thing was our backpacks. We'd left them leaning against one of the boulders, but now they were in a different spot, twisted and arranged in what seemed like a deliberate pattern, not torn open or damaged, just rearranged, like someone had been examining them. Derek pointed to the ground at the edge of camp, where the trees began. "Look," he said, "footprints, clear as day, 5-toed, huge, easily twice the size of my boot. They were sunk deep into the earth, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy, and they were spaced unusually far apart, suggesting a stride length that was impossible for a human. We didn't say much as we packed up our camp. We didn't cook breakfast or make coffee. We just shoved everything into our packs as quickly as possible. I remember my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. We didn't follow our original route. Instead, we took the most direct path back to the trailhead, which was about 14 miles away. We hiked at a brutal pace, barely stopping for water or to catch our breath. The whole time I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. Every time the trail went through a dense patch of trees, I'd get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. About 2 miles from the trailhead, we heard that scream again, far in the distance this time, but unmistakably the same sound from the night before. We practically ran the rest of the way. None of us talked about what happened for weeks afterward. When we finally did, it was clear the experience had changed all of us. Derek now carries a thermal scope whenever he goes hiking. Lewis never enters the woods without his sidearm. And me, I haven't slept in a tent since that night. I still hike occasionally, but only day hikes, always on popular trails, and I'm home well before dark. I've read about Bigfoot encounters over the years, trying to make sense of what happened to us. Some stories sound similar, but nothing quite matches the intensity of what we experienced. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch or some kind of unknown animal. All I know is that there was something intelligent out there in the North Cascades that night. Something that was curious about us, maybe testing us, maybe warning us. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away. Maybe it was just a bear, and our fear transformed it into something more. But then I remember that scream, those footprints, the way our backpacks were arranged, and Derek's description of what he saw. To this day, I get a knot in my stomach whenever I see pictures of the North Cascades. Beautiful as they are, I know there's something out there, something that doesn't want to be found. And I have no intention of looking for it ever again. Story 2. I don't really talk about this much. Most people look at you funny when you bring up stuff like this, and honestly, after 50+ years, I still feel my heart racing when I think about it. But I need to get this out there because it's been weighing on me, especially since my dad passed 2 years ago. He made us promise never to camp in that spot again, and we never did. It was the summer of '69. I was 13 at the time, the third oldest of the 6 Thompson kids. My father Robert, everyone called him Bob, had planned this camping trip along the Pearl River in central Mississippi. It was supposed to be this great family adventure. Mom, Dad, all 5 of us boys, my little sister Jenny, who was only 6, and our German shepherd, Duke. We were all excited. Dad had just gotten a new station wagon that could fit all of us, and we packed it to the brim with our tent, sleeping bags, fishing gear, and enough food for the 3 days we planned to stay. Looking back, I remember Mom, Elizabeth, seeming hesitant, which wasn't like her. She loved camping as much as Dad did. When I asked her what was wrong, she just smiled and said she was tired from packing. I didn't think anything of it then. The spot Dad picked was about 40 miles from our home in Jackson, down some dirt roads that didn't even have names, just county numbers. It was a beautiful clearing, maybe 50 yards from the riverbank, surrounded by dense woods. The trees there were massive, old growth pines and oaks that blocked out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of July, it felt cooler under those trees. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon and spent the next few hours setting up camp. Dad and my oldest brother James, who was 17, set up the big family tent while Mom organized our supplies. The rest of us kids were supposed to be gathering firewood, but we kept getting distracted by frogs and crawdads along the riverbank. The first sign something was off came that evening. Duke, who was normally the most laid-back dog you'd ever meet, wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing around the perimeter of our campsite, his ears perked up, sometimes growling softly at the woods. Dad figured there were probably deer or raccoons nearby, maybe even a bear, though they weren't common in that area. After dinner, hot dogs cooked over the fire. My younger brother Mikey, he was 10, needed to use the bathroom. Dad told him to just walk a little ways down the dirt road where we'd come in, not too far, but just for privacy. Mikey came running back maybe 2 minutes later, white as a sheet. "Someone's watching me," he said, breathing hard. Dad stood up immediately. "What do you mean?" "I felt eyes on me, from the woods." Mikey pointed toward a dense thicket of underbrush about 30 yards from our campsite. James grabbed the flashlight and walked over with Dad to check it out. They didn't find anything, and Dad told Mikey it was probably just nerves from being in a new place. But I remember looking at Duke, who was staring in the exact same direction Mikey had pointed, his body rigid. That night, we all slept in the big family tent, all 8 of us plus Duke, who Dad let in, even though he usually stayed outside when we camped. None of us slept well. The woods were too quiet. Anyone who's spent time outdoors knows there's always noise at night. Crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. But that night there was almost nothing, just the sound of the river in the distance. The next day seemed better. We went fishing, caught a few bass and catfish that Dad cleaned for dinner. We swam in a shallow part of the river where the current wasn't strong. It felt normal again, and I think we all kind of forgot about the weirdness from the night before. Even Duke seemed more relaxed, though he wouldn't go near the tree line on the far side of our camp. Everything changed that second night. We'd had a good dinner of fish and beans. Dad had built up the fire, and we were telling ghost stories, stupid stuff about hook-handed killers and vanishing hitchhikers. It was around 11:30 when Duke, who had been lying near the fire, suddenly stood up, his hackles raised. At first, he just stared into the darkness beyond our camp, growling low in his throat. Then, without warning, he bolted straight for the tent, clawing at the zippered entrance until Dad got up and let him in. I'd never seen him act like that before. Duke wasn't a coward. He'd once chased off a stray dog 3 times his size that had wandered into our yard back home. Mom looked at Dad, and something passed between them. Later, I found out they'd had a conversation I wasn't privy to. "I need to use the bathroom," Mom said, standing up. She grabbed the flashlight from the log we were sitting on. "You want me to come with you?" Dad asked. "No, I'll just be right over there," she said, pointing to a spot maybe 20 yards away where we dug a small latrine. She was gone maybe 2 minutes. When she came back, she wasn't walking. She was running, and the flashlight beam was bouncing wildly. She dropped down next to Dad, her breathing ragged. "We need to leave, now." Her voice was dead calm, which scared me more than if she'd been screaming. Dad didn't question her. "Pack up only what's essential," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "James, get the shotgun from the truck." The fear hit me then, like a physical thing. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag. Jenny started crying, and Mom shushed her, not unkindly, but with an urgency that made my stomach twist. "What did you see?" I finally asked Mom as we packed. "Something was watching me from near the truck," she whispered. "It was standing upright. It wasn't a bear." James came back with the shotgun, an old 12-gauge Dad kept for hunting. He looked scared, but trying hard not to show it. "I'll keep watch while you all pack," he said, trying to sound grown-up. We worked fast, throwing things into bags, without caring if they were organized. Duke stayed in the tent, whimpering, refusing to come out even when Dad called him. My youngest brother had to drag him out, and Duke pressed himself against our legs as we moved around the camp. We were almost done packing when James fired a shot into the air. "It's circling us!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "There's something moving around the perimeter." Dad grabbed the flashlight and shined it where James was pointing, but whatever it was had moved. The beam of light caught nothing but trees and underbrush. "Everyone to the truck now," Dad ordered. "Stay together." We moved as a group, Dad in the lead with the flashlight, James bringing up the rear with the shotgun. Mom carried Jenny, who was sobbing quietly against her shoulder. The truck was parked about 40 yards from our campsite, down a small incline. As we approached the truck, Dad's flashlight beam swept across the ground, and he stopped so suddenly that I crashed into him. "Bob, what is it?" Mom asked, her voice barely audible. Dad didn't answer. He just crouched down, shining the light at the soft earth near the driver's side door, right where Mom said she'd seen something watching her. There were footprints, not human footprints and not any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were huge. I remember Dad putting his hand next to one for scale, and it was easily 14 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide. The strangest part was that there seemed to be only 3 toes visible, splayed out wide. "Jesus Christ," Dad whispered, which scared me because he never took the Lord's name in vain. "Get in the truck, now." His voice had changed, become harder somehow. We piled in, Duke jumping on laps, the camping gear shoved in wherever it would fit. Dad started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the area in front of us. That's when I saw it. Just for a second at the edge of the light's reach, a tall figure, easily 6 or 7 feet, moving between 2 trees. It wasn't a man. The proportions were all wrong. The arms seemed too long, hanging down past where knees would be, and it was covered in hair that looked almost white in the headlights. As Dad threw the truck into reverse, the figure turned, and I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting red in the light, like a deer's eyes but higher off the ground. Then Dad spun the wheel, and we were bouncing down the dirt road, the headlights swinging wildly. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then Jenny asked in a small voice, "What was that, Daddy?" "I don't know, honey," Dad said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "But we're not going back there." When we got home around 2 in the morning, Aunt Sarah was waiting up. She lived in the mother-in-law suite attached to our house, and apparently Mom had called her before we left to say we were coming home early. What she told us next made my blood run cold. She tried to warn Mom before we left, but Mom had brushed it off. 3 weeks earlier, Aunt Sarah had gone fishing in that same area with her church group. She'd wandered a bit away from the others to find a better spot, and felt like she was being watched. When she looked up, she saw something standing in the trees watching her, something tall and covered in whitish hair, with a strangely pointed head, long arms and eyes that caught the light strangely. She dropped her fishing gear and run back to the group, but when they returned, nothing was there except for some broken branches high up where no person could have reached. Mom started crying then, saying she should have listened. Apparently that's why she'd been hesitant about the trip. The next day, Dad called the county sheriff to report what we'd seen. The deputy who came out took notes politely enough, but I could tell he didn't believe us. He said it was probably a bear, though he couldn't explain the footprints Dad described. He promised to send someone out to check the area, but we never heard anything back. We never went camping in that part of the state again. In fact, it was years before Dad took us camping anywhere. When we did start going again, he was different, constantly vigilant, always keeping us close to the campsite, always making sure we were back well before dark. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what we saw that night. Could it have been a person playing a prank? Maybe. But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere? And how do you explain the footprints? A bear standing on its hind legs. Bears don't walk upright for long distances, and they don't have 3-toed feet. Some kind of deformed human living in the woods. I've gone down every rabbit hole of explanation, and none of them fit. What I know for certain is that something was out there. Something intelligent enough to circle our camp, to know to watch us from the darkness. Something that terrified our dog so badly he refused to leave the tent. Something with footprints unlike anything I've ever seen documented. I went back once, about 15 years ago, after Dad had his first heart attack. I didn't tell anyone in the family. They would have thought I was crazy. I just needed to see the place again with adult eyes. The dirt road was paved by then, and there were a few houses scattered along the river where there had been none before. I found our camping spot, or what I thought was it. The clearing was overgrown now, but the big trees were still there. I only stayed about 10 minutes. The whole time, I had that same feeling Mikey described all those years ago, like I was being watched. I left before I could find out if I was right. Whatever was out there in '69 might still be there. Or maybe there are more of them. I don't know, and I don't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but I still don't go into the woods after dark. And neither does anyone else in my family. Story 3. I still get goosebumps talking about it. It's been over 5 years, and I've only told a handful of people because I know how it sounds. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. Nate and I had been planning this trip for months. We're both experienced hikers. I've done sections of the PCT, and Nate practically lives outdoors when he's not working his construction job. We wanted something remote, a place where we could truly disconnect. The Poseidon Wilderness in Washington State seemed perfect, rugged, beautiful, and far from the usual tourist trails. Our plan was simple, a 7-day trek through one of the most isolated sections west of Horseshoe Basin. We had all the gear, topographical maps, emergency supplies, the works. What we didn't pack was enough common sense to turn back when things got weird. The first 3 days were amazing. The weather held up. We saw incredible wildlife, deer, a black bear at a safe distance, eagles soaring overhead. We even managed to catch some trout for dinner one night. It was exactly the wilderness experience we'd been craving. On the 4th day, we hiked about 12 miles to reach this gorgeous spot beside a rocky bluff overlooking a small lake. The view was breathtaking. We set up camp about 50 yards from the water's edge, in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pines and firs. Some of these trees were massive. I'm talking centuries old. That evening we cooked dinner over our small camp stove and watched the sunset reflect off the lake. Perfect end to a perfect day, right? That's when things started to feel off. Nate was the first to notice. "Hey, Marcy," he said, pointing across the lake. "What's that over there?" At first, I couldn't see anything. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows. But then I spotted it. A dark shape standing at the tree line on the opposite shore. It was hard to make out details at that distance, maybe 300 yards away, but it seemed tall and bulky. Not a bear. It was standing upright. "Probably just another hiker," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. We hadn't seen another person in 2 days, and this, whatever it was, didn't have a backpack or gear that I could see. We watched it for maybe 5 minutes. It didn't move much, just shifted slightly from side to side. Then it simply stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I remember feeling relieved when it was gone, which is weird because I hadn't realized I was tense. That's also when I first noticed the smell. It hit me suddenly, this awful musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify, something musky and animal. I asked Nate if he smelled it too, and he nodded. "Could be a dead animal nearby," he suggested, but we both kept glancing across the lake. We turned in early that night, exhausted from the day's hike. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up around midnight needing to pee. I hate getting out of the tent at night, but when you gotta go, you gotta go. I grabbed my headlamp and slipped out into the darkness. That's when I noticed how eerily quiet it was. If you've spent time in forests at night, you know they're never actually silent. There's always something, frogs, insects, the rustle of nocturnal animals. But that night, there was nothing. Complete, unnatural silence, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I did my business as quickly as possible and hurried back to the tent. I didn't mention the silence to Nate. He was half asleep anyway, but it took me a long time to drift off again. The next morning, we both commented on how quiet the forest was. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the lake seemed unnaturally still. We tried to shake it off, blaming it on changes in the weather or some natural phenomenon we didn't understand. We spent the day exploring the area around our camp, though neither of us suggested venturing to the other side of the lake. That night, things escalated. We had just gotten into our sleeping bags around 10 p.m. when we heard it, the distinct sound of a tree cracking. Not the normal creaking of branches in the wind, but the sharp, violent snap of wood breaking. It came from the direction of the lake. "Probably a dead tree falling," Nate whispered, but I could hear the tension in his voice. About 20 minutes later, something landed near our tent with a dull thud. Nate unzipped the tent flap and shined his flashlight out. It was a rock about the size of a baseball, sitting there like someone had tossed it. "Could have fallen from the bluff," he said, zipping the tent back up. But the bluff was behind us, and the rock had come from the direction of the lake. We lay there in silence, listening. Every tiny sound seemed magnified. The rustling of our sleeping bags, our breathing. I don't think either of us slept much. Then, at what must have been around 3 a.m., we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching our tent. They weren't the 4-beat steps of a bear or deer. These were bipedal, left, right, the unmistakable gait of something walking on 2 legs. But the stride was too long to be human, and each step made the ground vibrate slightly beneath us. I grabbed Nate's arm, squeezing so hard he later had bruises. We lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled our tent once slowly, then they stopped right by the entrance. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing. Not the panting of an animal, but controlled inhalations and exhalations. Whatever was out there was huge. I could sense its presence, its mass, standing just inches from where we lay. Then came the most terrifying part. I felt something drag across the outside of the tent, fingers or claws, I don't know, running from the top down to about halfway. The fabric dipped inward with the pressure. Then the creature exhaled sharply, almost like a snort, and began walking away. The footsteps receded toward the lake, and eventually we couldn't hear them anymore. Neither of us slept after that. We sat huddled together in the tent, Nate with his hunting knife in hand, fat lot of good that would do, waiting for dawn. When the first light finally came, we were almost too scared to leave the tent. When we did venture out, the evidence was unmistakable. All around our campsite were footprints, massive, barefoot impressions pressed deep into the soft forest floor. They were nowhere near human-sized, at least 17 or 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was immense, easily twice what a tall human could manage. The prints circled our tent exactly as we'd heard during the night, with one set stopping right where the creature had stood by the entrance. From there, they led back toward the lake, disappearing where the ground became rockier. But that wasn't all. About 30 yards from our camp, we found something that made my blood run cold. A strange arrangement of stripped bark and broken twigs, stacked in a cone-like shape about 3 feet high. At the base was a perfectly round, smooth stone that looked out of place, like it had been carried there. It wasn't random forest debris. This was clearly constructed, arranged with purpose. I wanted to leave immediately, to pack up and get out of there, but Nate, always the more level-headed one, reminded me that we were at least a 2-day hike from the nearest trailhead. He suggested we move camp, find somewhere more open where we could see anything approaching. It was probably just curious, he said, not sounding convinced himself. If it wanted to hurt us, it had every opportunity. I knew he was right, logically, but logic doesn't do much when you're faced with something that shouldn't exist. We moved camp about a mile away, finding a spot in a small meadow with good visibility. We gathered extra firewood, planning to keep the fire going all night. Neither of us said the words Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I know we were both thinking it. The next 2 days were a nightmare of paranoia. We constantly felt watched. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, like all the wildlife was hiding. We heard distant knocking sounds, wood on wood, like someone striking trees with a stick. Sometimes we'd hear splashes in the lake when nothing was visibly there. On our 6th night, as we huddled by our fire, a piercing shriek echoed through the trees. It wasn't any animal call I recognized, too loud for a fox, too high-pitched for a bear, nothing like the screech of a mountain lion. It was somewhere between a scream and a howl, carrying for what seemed like miles. Then we heard running, fast, powerful movement circling our position just beyond the firelight. Whatever it was moving quicker than any human could through dense forest in darkness. It circled us 3 times, each circuit drawing closer before retreating into the night. That was it. We didn't even discuss it. We packed up essential gear before dawn and started hiking out at first light, leaving behind non-essentials to travel faster. We covered what should have been 2 days of hiking in a single grueling day, pushing ourselves to the point of exhaustion. When we finally reached the trailhead and saw Nate's truck, I broke down in tears of relief. I've never been so happy to see civilization. I've analyzed this experience 1,000 times since then. I've read countless accounts of Bigfoot encounters, noted the similarities to our experience. The rock throwing, the wood knocking, the structures, the footprints, the smell. I've looked for rational explanations, but none fit all the evidence. Nate has actually gone back to the Poseidon Wilderness since then, though never to that exact spot, and never without his satellite phone and sidearm. He says he's curious, that he wants to understand what's out there. Me? I won't set foot in those woods again. Some things aren't meant to be understood. I don't tell this story often because I know how it sounds. But whatever inhabits that wilderness, and I'm convinced something does, it's intelligent, territorial, and doesn't welcome human visitors. It let us leave that time. I'm not willing to push my luck again. Sometimes at night, I still hear that shriek in my dreams, still feel those fingers dragging across the tent fabric, and I wake up wondering what would have happened if it had decided we weren't allowed to leave. Story 4. I still haven't been camping since that night in October 2018. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those sounds again, that deep grunting that still makes my skin crawl. My therapist says writing about it might help, so here goes. I was 15 back then. My buddy Tyler and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We'd gone camping together since we were kids, but this was our first time without adults. We convinced our parents we were responsible enough, and after days of begging, they finally agreed. I'd been camping in the mountains near Dayton, Tennessee countless times with my dad. It was about 30 miles from our homes in Chattanooga, and I knew the area pretty well, or thought I did. We chose an old logging area that had been abandoned for years. It was remote enough to feel like a real adventure, but not so remote that we'd get completely lost. The area is heavily forested with these massive old-growth trees that block out most of the sunlight even during the day. In October, the weather was perfect, cool, but not cold, and the bugs weren't too bad. We arrived at the trailhead around noon that Saturday. It was one of those perfect fall days, clear skies, temperatures in the low 60s. The leaves were changing, all those reds and oranges against the evergreens. I remember feeling so free. Just me and Tyler with our backpacks, my .22 rifle for protection against coyotes, my dad always insisted, and enough junk food to last us the weekend. The hike up took about 3 hours. We were aiming for this small clearing near the top of one of the smaller mountains, a spot my dad had shown me a few years back. It had an amazing view of the valley below and was sheltered enough from the wind. By the time we reached it, we were both sweating and ready to set up camp. We got the tent up quickly and collected firewood before it got dark. Everything was going exactly as planned. We had hot dogs for dinner, cooked over the fire, and were just sitting around joking and talking about school, girls, the usual stuff. The sun had gone down, but we had a good fire going, and honestly, I felt totally comfortable. This was my element. Around 8 o'clock, I needed to take a leak, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked maybe 30 yards into the trees. I didn't want to go too far, but far enough for privacy, you know? I was just finishing up when I heard something weird, the sound of small branches or twigs being thrown through the trees. At first, I thought it was Tyler messing with me. It wouldn't be the first time he tried to scare me in the woods. "Very funny, Tyler," I called out, zipping up my pants. "I know it's you." There was no answer, just another small branch landing a few feet to my right. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but couldn't see anything except trees and undergrowth. A little uneasy now, I headed back to camp. When I got there, Tyler was still sitting by the fire, poking at it with a stick. "Dude, not cool with the branch throwing," I said. He looked at me, confused. "What are you talking about? I've been right here the whole time. Someone was throwing sticks at me while I was peeing." Tyler laughed. "Probably just squirrels, man. Or maybe you disturbed a bird's nest or something." I wanted to believe him. It made sense, and I felt stupid for being spooked. We went back to our conversation, but I kept glancing over my shoulder toward the trees. Something felt off. but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. About 15 minutes later, while we were roasting marshmallows, something hit me in the back. I jumped up, spinning around. It was a stick, about a foot long. But what freaked me out wasn't just that someone or something had thrown it. It was that the stick was freshly twisted off a tree. You could see where the wood had been wrenched apart, not broken cleanly. The end was still damp with sap. Tyler saw it too. "What the hell?" he whispered, standing up next to me. "There's someone out there," I said, my voice barely audible. We both stood still, scanning the darkness beyond our campfire. The forest suddenly seemed much darker, the shadows deeper and more threatening. The fire crackled behind us, and every small sound from the woods made me flinch. That's when we heard it, a low, deep grunt that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. I'd been in these woods my whole life, heard coyotes, bears, all kinds of wildlife. This was different. It was almost human, but not quite. Lower, more guttural. And it wasn't just one grunt. It was a series of them, almost like someone trying to communicate. "What is that?" Tyler whispered, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, there was a loud thud, like something heavy striking a tree, then another and another. Whatever it was hitting trees with significant force. My heart was racing. I remembered my rifle and rushed to grab it from the tent. I'd never shot at anything bigger than a tin can, but having it in my hands made me feel marginally safer. Tyler grabbed his high-powered flashlight, the kind that can light up things from 100 yards away. The grunting continued, moving around us now, like whatever was making the noise was circling our camp. It would stop for 30 seconds, then start again from a different location. "We need to see what it is," Tyler said, his hand shaking as he held the flashlight. I nodded, too scared to speak. We moved together, back to back, as Tyler aimed his light toward where the last sound had come from. At first, we saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then, Tyler adjusted the beam slightly to the left, and that's when we saw it. About 25 yards away, standing beside a massive oak tree, was something. The moment the light hit it, it moved partly behind the trunk, but not before we got a good look. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in thick reddish-brown hair that looked matted in places. The shape was humanoid, but much larger, bulkier through the shoulders and chest than any person I'd ever seen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My finger was on the trigger of my .22, but I knew it would be useless against something that size. Besides, I was shaking so badly I doubted I could hit anything. Then the smell hit us. This overwhelming stench, like rotting animal carcasses mixed with wet dog. It was so strong, it made my eyes water, and Tyler gagged beside me. The creature made another sound, different this time. A long, drawn-out growl that rose and fell in pitch. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, something between a bear's growl and a man moaning in pain. It made the hair on my arms stand up, and a wave of primal fear washed over me. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. Tyler must have felt the same, because he whispered, "We need to get the hell out of here now." I nodded, unable to speak. We started backing away slowly toward our tent. The creature stayed partially hidden behind the tree, but I could feel it watching us. Every few seconds, Tyler would sweep the flashlight back to check its position, and each time, it hadn't moved from behind that oak. We quickly doused our fire with the water from our canteens. I didn't want to leave our camping gear, but there was no way we were staying, and we couldn't waste time packing up. We grabbed only what was essential: our flashlights, my rifle, our phones, though there was no signal, and our jackets. As we backed away toward the trail, the vocalizations changed again. Now it was making this series of whooping sounds, almost like calls. The terrifying part was that somewhere in the distance we heard a response, similar whoops, but fainter, coming from farther down the mountain. "There's more than one," Tyler whispered, his voice breaking. That was it. We turned and ran. We abandoned any pretense of being calm and just bolted down the trail. It was insanely dangerous, running down a mountain trail in the darkness with only our flashlights to guide us. One wrong step and we could have broken an ankle or worse, but fear pushed all those concerns aside. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind us, to feel a hand grab my shoulder. But nothing came, just our own frantic breathing and the sound of our boots on the trail. We ran for what felt like forever. My lungs were burning, my legs turning to jelly, but I didn't slow down. Neither did Tyler. At some point, I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face from fear and exertion. I didn't care. When we finally reached the trailhead and saw Tyler's dad's car where we'd left it, I nearly collapsed with relief. We jumped in, Tyler fumbling with the keys, and locked the doors. We sat there for a minute, just trying to catch our breath, looking back up the dark trail we'd just fled down. "What the fuck was that?" Tyler finally said, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. I don't know. The drive home was mostly silent. What could we say? We both knew what we'd seen, but saying it out loud seemed impossible. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. The way it moved, the sounds it made, the smell. It was something else. When we got back to Chattanooga, it was almost midnight. We'd agreed on the way home to say we got spooked by coyotes. Who would believe the truth? We'd be laughed at, or worse, people would think we were lying for attention. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing by the tree, heard those grunts and whoops. I kept smelling that awful stench, like it had followed me home. The next day, Tyler and I talked on the phone. We agreed that what we'd seen matched descriptions of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. We spent hours online, reading accounts from other people who claimed to have had similar encounters. So many details matched. The stick throwing, the tree knocking, the vocalizations, the smell. It was both terrifying and somehow validating to know we weren't alone. We never told anyone the full truth. My parents wondered why all our camping gear was still up on the mountain, but we stuck to the coyote story. A week later, my dad drove me back up so we could retrieve our stuff. I was terrified, but I couldn't let him go alone, and I couldn't explain why I was so afraid. Thankfully, it was daytime, and we found our campsite undisturbed. No signs of what had happened that night. Part of me wondered if we'd imagined it all, but then I'd remember that smell, those sounds, and I knew it was real. That was my last camping trip. I used to love the outdoors, but after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was in the woods. I stopped hiking too. It was like the forest had become this forbidden zone for me. 2 years later, my dad got a job offer in Las Vegas, and we moved. I was secretly relieved. The Nevada desert couldn't be more different from the thick forests of eastern Tennessee. There's nowhere for anything to hide out here. I'm 17 now, and I still have nightmares about that night. Tyler and I don't talk much anymore. The distance made it hard to stay close, but I think there was also this unspoken thing between us. That night changed us both. I've tried to make sense of what happened. Was it really a Sasquatch? Some unknown species living in the Appalachian wilderness? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know. All I know is what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. And 4 years later, I still can't explain it. Sometimes I think about going back, facing my fears, but then I remember those eyes watching us from behind that tree, and I know I never will. Some things are better left alone, and whatever lives in those mountains is definitely one of them. I've never written this all down before. It feels good to get it out, but also terrifying to remember every detail. If you've had a similar experience, I'd like to hear about it. Maybe it would help to know I'm not the only one who's encountered something that shouldn't exist, something science can't explain. All I know is that night in October changed everything for me. And sometimes, when I wake up from those nightmares, I swear I can still hear those whoops echoing in the distance, calling to me. Story 5. I've been debating whether to share this experience for almost 10 years now. What happened to me and my friends in the Alpine Lakes wilderness still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or make up stories for attention. Before this, I would have laughed if someone told me a similar account, but I can't explain what we encountered out there, and I need to get this off my chest. It was July of 2013. Me, Chris, Sam, and Alex had been planning this fishing trip for months. We're all experienced hikers who've spent plenty of time in the backcountry, but we wanted to try somewhere new. Chris had heard about this small, unnamed lake deep in the Alpine Lakes wilderness that was supposedly great for trout fishing and completely isolated. The isolation was the appeal. No other campers, no noise, just us and nature. The hike-in was brutal. 7 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, the last 2 miles without a clear trail. We had to use topographic maps and GPS to navigate to this hidden lake nestled between steep ridgelines. By the time we arrived in the late afternoon, we were exhausted but excited. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water reflecting the surrounding pines and mountain peaks. It seemed like the perfect spot. We set up our 2 tents about 20 yards from the shoreline on a flat area with a good view of the water. Sam got a small fire going while Alex and Chris unpacked our fishing gear. I remember feeling this weird sense of being watched as I was setting up my tent, but I brushed it off as just being in an unfamiliar place. We cooked some freeze-dried meals, drank a few beers we'd packed in, and traded stories around the fire as the sun set. Everything was normal. I'm a light sleeper, always have been. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. Chris was snoring beside me in our tent. I grabbed my headlamp and quietly unzipped the tent to step outside. The night was clear and cold, with a bright moon illuminating the lake and surrounding area. As I was standing there relieving myself at the edge of our campsite, I caught a whiff of something awful, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't describe. It was so strong it made me gag. That's when I noticed it. Across the lake, just beyond the tree line, was a tall shape. And I mean tall. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet. At first, I thought it was just a dead tree or a shadow trick from the moonlight. But then it moved. It shifted slightly, turning what seemed to be its head in my direction. I froze completely. My headlamp wasn't strong enough to illuminate that distance, but I could see this dark silhouette against the tree line. It stood there motionless, just watching. I backed slowly into the tent, zipped it up, and laid there wide awake for hours. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, or my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place at night. When morning came, I told the guys about what I'd seen and smelled. They didn't exactly laugh me off, but they weren't taking it seriously either. "Probably just a bear, dude," Sam said, sipping his instant coffee. "Or maybe a moose," Alex suggested. "They can look weird in the dark." Chris was more thoughtful. "Did it move like an animal?" "Not really," I admitted. "It was just standing there, like a person, but way bigger." "Well, if it was Bigfoot, he would have left some giant tracks," Chris joked. "Let's check the other side of the lake later when we go fishing." I tried to laugh it off, but something felt off to me. The smell had been so distinct, and that shape hadn't moved like any animal I'd ever seen. The day started normally enough. We had breakfast, grabbed our fishing gear, and spread out along different points of the shoreline. The fishing was great. We caught several rainbow trout within the first couple hours. But around midday, I noticed something strange. The birds had stopped singing. The whole forest had gone completely silent. I called over to Sam, who was fishing about 50 yards away. "Hey, you notice how quiet it got?" He paused and looked around. Yeah, that is weird. Wind died down too. We all felt it, this sudden tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. We tried to shake it off and continued fishing, but the unease lingered. As the afternoon wore on, we all gradually moved closer together, unconsciously sticking near one another rather than spreading out. We kept glancing toward the tree line and the ridges above us. I suggested checking the opposite shore where I'd seen the figure, but when we got there, we found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of the ordinary. But the silence persisted. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That evening around the campfire, we were all on edge. The conversation kept dying as we paused to listen to every little sound from the forest. We went to bed earlier than planned, around 10. None of us wanted to admit it, but I think we all felt safer in our tents, as if thin nylon walls could protect us from whatever was out there. I was sharing a tent with Chris, while Sam and Alex were in the other. I dozed off eventually, but sleep didn't last long. Around midnight, we were all jolted awake by an enormous crash, like a full-sized tree falling nearby. It was followed immediately by what I can only describe as deep, guttural grunts. "What the fuck was that?" Chris whispered, now fully awake beside me. Before I could answer, we heard it. Heavy footsteps moving through the brush around the lake, not like a deer or even a bear. These were deliberate, powerful steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. We could hear branches snapping under its weight. "Guys, you hearing this?" Alex called in a hushed voice from the other tent. "Shh," Sam hissed back. The footsteps circled around, moving closer to our campsite. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Chris had his hunting knife out, clutching it like it would do anything against whatever was out there. Then the footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was complete silence. I was holding my breath, straining to hear any indication of where it was. Then something pressed against the side of our tent, something massive that pushed the tent wall in toward us. I could see the outline of what seemed like a hand or paw, much larger than any human hand, pressing against the fabric. Chris and I scrambled to the opposite side of the tent, absolutely terrified. The pressure remained for several long seconds, then released. The footsteps moved away, circling to where Sam and Alex's tent was. I heard Alex whisper, "Oh my God," from their tent. Whatever it was, circled both tents several times. Then, from what sounded like the edge of our campsite, it let out this sound, a sharp, guttural bark that turned into a long, low moan that made my blood run cold. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. It had this intelligence to it, like it was trying to communicate something. After that, silence fell again. We stayed completely still, nobody daring to go outside or even speak above a whisper. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We just sat there in our tents, listening, waiting. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we finally worked up the courage to look outside. What we found still haunts me. Our campsite had been systematically disturbed. There were massive footprints, 18 to 20 inches long, circling both tents. They weren't clear impressions like you'd see in mud, but depressions in the pine needles and dirt that clearly showed something huge had walked around us repeatedly. Near our fire pit, someone or something had stacked stones in a small pyramid about a foot high. None of us had built that. One of my fishing poles, which I'd left leaning against a log, had been snapped in half and carefully placed on the edge of a boulder near the water. "We need to get the fuck out of here," Alex said, his voice shaking as he stared at the broken fishing rod. Nobody argued. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking as we stuffed our gear haphazardly into our packs. The silence of the forest was still absolute. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead quiet. We hit the trail by 6:30 in the morning, moving as fast as we could. The entire 7-mile hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. At one point, about 2 miles from the lake, a rock tumbled down the slope behind us. We all stopped and looked back. It hadn't fallen naturally. It seemed like it had been pushed. Chris, who'd been the most skeptical initially, whispered, "It's following us." We practically jogged the rest of the way out. About a mile from the trailhead, the birds suddenly started singing again. The forest came back to life, as if we'd crossed some invisible boundary. We all felt it. Whatever had been following us had stopped. When we reached our cars, we threw our gear in and sat there for a minute, just processing what had happened. None of us could explain it. None of us wanted to. "That wasn't a bear," Sam finally said, breaking the silence. We all nodded. Whatever it was had intelligence. It had deliberately circled our tents, built that stone stack, broken my fishing rod, and placed it where I would find it. It was sending a message. We promised to talk about it later, but when we got back to civilization, none of us really wanted to discuss it. We'd text each other occasionally with thoughts or questions, but mostly we just tried to forget. It's been almost 10 years now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find explanations. I've read about bears, mountain lions, elk. None of them behave like what we experienced. I've also looked into Bigfoot accounts and found disturbing similarities to what happened to us. I know how this sounds. I was the skeptic once. But when you're out there in the dark and you hear that sound, that deep guttural call that's neither fully animal nor human, you know you're not at the top of the food chain. You know you're not alone. None of us has ever gone back to that lake. None of us ever will. Something intelligent and territorial lives in those mountains, and it made it very clear we were trespassing on its land. I don't know what to call it, but I know what I experienced. I still fish, I still hike, but I never go anywhere without telling multiple people exactly where I'll be. And I never, ever dismiss the silence of the forest when the birds suddenly stop singing. Story 6. It was September 18th, 2022, a Sunday night. I remember because I had work the next morning and kept checking the time, knowing I should head home. I was at my buddy Mike's place out near Granite Falls. His house is pretty isolated, set back from the main roads with dense forest surrounding most of the property. We'd been watching football all day, and I'd stayed later than planned, catching up since we hadn't seen each other in months. It was around 11:15 p.m. when I finally decided to leave. Mike offered to let me crash on his couch, but I had an early meeting I couldn't miss. The night was unusually dark, one of those cloudy, moonless nights where you can barely see your hand in front of your face once you're away from house lights. It had rained earlier, so everything was wet, and the air had that heavy, damp smell that's so typical of the Pacific Northwest. As I was leaving, Mike warned me to keep an eye out for deer on the drive back. They're always crossing the roads out there, especially at night, and I've had a few close calls before. I got in my pickup truck, a 2014 Ford F-150, and started the roughly 40-minute drive back to my place. The roads out there are winding and narrow, with tall trees on both sides that make it feel like you're driving through a tunnel at times. About 10 minutes after leaving Mike's house, I came to a four-way intersection. It's a weird spot. No traffic lights, just stop signs, and hardly any street lights. There's never much traffic there, especially that late on a Sunday. I came to a complete stop, checked both ways out of habit, though I knew there wouldn't be any cars. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. My radio wasn't on, and all I could hear was the hum of my engine and the occasional splat of water dripping from the trees onto my truck. That's when I noticed something in my peripheral vision, just a slight movement in the trees to my right. At first I thought it was just branches swaying in the wind, but there wasn't any wind that night. Everything was still. I turned my head to look directly, and that's when I felt this, I don't know how to describe it, this feeling wash over me, like when you suddenly realize you're not alone in a room you thought was empty. There was something there, watching me from between the trees, maybe 15 yards away from my truck. I could just make out a dark shape that seemed to be moving slightly. I squinted, trying to get a better look, thinking it might be a bear. We get black bears in the area sometimes, though they usually avoid the roads. Then it moved forward, out from the tree line and into the dim glow cast by my headlights. Holy shit! I'm getting goosebumps even typing this now. What stepped out of those woods wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was standing upright like a person, but it was enormous. I'm talking at least 7 feet tall, possibly even taller. And it wasn't just tall, it was wide. The shoulders on this thing were literally twice as broad as mine, and I'm not a small guy at 6'1" and 220 pounds. It had this massive barrel chest and long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The entire body was covered in dark brown hair or fur. Not like a costume, but like actual fur growing from skin. The fur wasn't perfectly uniform in color either. There were these noticeable patches of gray around what I assume was its chest and face, almost like an older animal that was starting to show its age. Its face. I didn't get a super clear look because of the distance and poor lighting, but what I could see was nothing like a human face. It had this pronounced brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, making them look sunken in. The nose was wide and flat, and the jaw seemed to jut forward more than a human's would. The way it moved was what really got to me. It walked upright just like a person would, but there was something different about its gait. More fluid and powerful, like each step covered more ground than should be possible. And it was completely silent. With something that big, you'd expect to hear heavy footfalls or branches breaking. But there was nothing. Just this massive figure moving through the night without making a sound. The worst part? It was coming straight toward my truck. Not in a running or charging way, but with this purposeful walk, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Its eyes. I swear they were reflecting my headlights slightly, like a cat's or dog's eyes do at night. I sat there frozen for maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like forever. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then pure instinct kicked in. I hit the gas pedal hard, probably leaving skid marks as my truck lurched forward through the intersection. I didn't even look both ways again. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. As I accelerated away, I checked my rearview mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This thing, this creature, crossed the entire width of the intersection in just 2 strides. 2. That's a distance that would take me at least 6 or 7 steps to cover. Then it disappeared back into the tree line on the opposite side of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. I pushed my truck well over the speed limit all the way home, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure nothing was following me. I kept all the doors locked and windows up, though I knew that if this thing wanted to get to me, a car door wouldn't stop it. When I finally got home, I sat in my driveway with the engine running for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the surroundings before I worked up the nerve to make a dash for my front door. I double-checked all the locks that night, and even pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door before trying to sleep, which didn't happen much. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the shadows and trees had played tricks on my eyes. But I know what I saw. That thing was real. It was solid and 3-dimensional and moving with purpose. As the days passed, I started to connect this sighting with something that had happened to me years earlier in almost the exact same area. I was probably 19 or 20 at the time, and a group of us were walking back to our cars after hanging out at a friend's house near Granite Falls. It was around 1 a.m. and we were all sober. We had school and work the next day. We were walking along this quiet back road when we heard this sound coming from the woods. It started as this deep, guttural grunt that gradually built into something like a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I've ever heard. It was lower, more powerful, and it seemed to carry forever through the trees. We all stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other. No one said anything, but I could see on everyone's faces that we were all thinking the same thing. What the hell was that? One of my friends, Jake, whispered, "That's not a normal animal." We picked up our pace after that, practically jogging back to our cars. No one wanted to be the one to suggest it out loud. But later, when we were safely driving away, Jake said what we'd all been thinking. That sounded like a Sasquatch or something. We laughed it off at the time, but none of us had a better explanation. And now, after what I saw at that intersection, I'm not laughing anymore. Since that night last September, I've done a ton of research online about Sasquatch sightings in Washington state. There are hundreds of them, many in areas not far from where I had my encounter. Some of the descriptions match exactly what I saw. The height, the build, the coloring, the silent movement. I've read accounts of people hearing vocalizations similar to what my friends and I heard years ago. I haven't driven on that stretch of road after dark since the incident. I've taken longer routes or made excuses not to visit Mike if I know I'd have to drive back after sunset. When I told Mike about what happened, he didn't outright dismiss me. Instead, he mentioned that a couple of his neighbors had reported strange noises in the woods and finding unusually large footprints on their properties after rainy nights. One thing that keeps bothering me is how deliberate the creature's approach seemed. It wasn't startled by my truck or my headlights. It didn't run away like most wild animals would. It walked directly toward me with what felt like intention. Was it curious, territorial, aggressive? I don't know, and that's what scares me the most. The speed of this thing was incredible too. Crossing that road in just 2 strides, that's not normal. That intersection is at least 20 feet across, which means each of its steps covered about 10 feet of ground. And it did this effortlessly, without running or seemingly exerting itself. Just 2 casual strides, and it was gone. The silence is another thing I can't get over. Something that big should make noise when it moves, especially through forest undergrowth at night. But there was nothing. No crackling leaves, no snapping twigs, no heavy breathing. Just this massive figure gliding through the darkness like it was part of it. I keep wondering if it's still out there, in those woods, watching and waiting. I wonder how many other people have seen it, but were too afraid of ridicule to come forward with their stories. I wonder if it's the same creature my friends and I heard years ago, or if there's more than one of them living in the forests around Granite Falls. I've thought about reporting my sighting to local authorities, but what would I say? Hello, police. I saw Bigfoot crossing the road last night. They'd think I was drunk or high or just messing with them. And honestly, what could they do? Send officers out to look for a creature that can apparently vanish into the forest without a trace? Sometimes I try to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a really tall person in a ghillie suit or something. But who would be wandering around the woods at 11:30 at night in that kind of outfit? And no human could move the way this thing moved or cover ground that quickly. I've gone back to that intersection a few times during daylight hours, trying to find any evidence. Footprints, hair caught on branches, anything. But I haven't found a thing. The ground is usually covered in pine needles and fallen leaves, which don't hold prints well, and the constant rain washes away any traces that might be left behind. One time, about 2 weeks after the sighting, I worked up the courage to pull over at that same intersection during the day. I walked a little way into the woods where I'd seen the creature emerge. It was much less intimidating in the daylight, with birds chirping and the occasional car passing by. But about 20 yards in, I got that same feeling I had in my truck. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I quickly headed back to my car and drove away. I haven't told many people about what happened. My girlfriend knows, and she believes me because she says she's never seen me so genuinely shaken up about anything before. A couple close friends know too, but I can tell from their reactions that they think I'm exaggerating or that my eyes were playing tricks on me. That's why I'm sharing this here. I need to tell people who won't automatically dismiss me or think I'm crazy. I need to know if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. I need to know I'm not alone in what I saw. because the truth is, that night changed me. I used to love hiking and camping and spending time in the woods. Now, I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, watching and waiting. Every time I hear a twig snap or leaves rustle when I'm outdoors, my heart starts racing. Every shadow at dusk seems to hold the silhouette of that creature. I don't know what I saw that night at the intersection near Granite Falls. I don't know if it was what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and for whatever reason, it was approaching my vehicle with purpose. And if I hadn't driven away when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last summer. It was July 2018, unseasonably warm even for Washington State. I remember because my truck's AC was struggling and I had the windows down, letting in that heavy pine smell that fills the air around Elmer. My Aunt Linda has this property out past the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a single-level house with a detached garage on about 2 acres, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. She'd gone to visit my cousin in Portland for the weekend and asked me to check on her 3 dogs. I'd done it plenty of times before. Feed them, let them run around a bit, make sure they had water, simple stuff. It was getting late, maybe around 8:30 or so, but in summer it stays light until almost 10, so visibility wasn't an issue. The sun was low, casting those long shadows through the trees, but I could still see everything clearly. I remember thinking how quiet it was out there. No traffic noise, just birds and the occasional rustle from the woods. I turned off the main road onto her gravel driveway, which curves slightly before opening up to the yard between the house and garage. That's when it happened. As I was making that turn, something moved at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was one of the dogs that had gotten out somehow. But in that split second, my brain registered that whatever I was seeing wasn't a dog, not even close. This thing darted out from the tree line on my right. It moved fast, really fast, but in a controlled way. What hit me immediately was that it was running upright, on 2 legs. Not like a bear standing up momentarily, but actually running bipedally with purpose and balance. It was small, maybe 3.5 to 4 feet tall. I could gauge this because it passed right by the corner of the garage where my aunt keeps her trash cans, which are about 3 feet high. The creature was definitely taller than the cans. It had this dark reddish-brown hair covering its body, not fur exactly, more like hair, longer on some parts than others. The color reminded me of a chestnut horse, that deep reddish-brown. The way it moved, that's what keeps coming back to me. It ran low to the ground, but definitely upright, with a slight forward lean, arms swinging slightly by its sides. Not flailing wildly, but purposeful, like a person running. In those few seconds, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a rounded head sitting directly on broad shoulders. No real neck that I could see. Its proportions were all wrong for a human child. The arms seemed longer than they should be. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 3 or 4 seconds. It crossed from the tree line to behind the garage in one fluid sprint. I hit the brakes immediately, my truck skidding slightly on the gravel. My first thought was, what the hell was that? Followed quickly by, is there someone out here playing a prank? But something in my gut told me this wasn't a prank. The movement was too natural, too fluid. And who would be out here anyway? My aunt's nearest neighbor is almost half a mile away. I sat there for a good 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to process what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the dogs. They were all in the fenced side yard, barking, not frantically like they were terrified, but alertly, the way they do when a deer passes by or when someone new arrives. They were facing the direction where the creature had disappeared. I should have just backed out and left. That would have been the smart thing to do, but I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a child from one of the properties further down the road, though I couldn't imagine what a kid would be doing out here alone at this hour, or why they'd be covered in what looked like hair. So I pulled the truck up to the house and put it in park. That's when the feeling hit me, this overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up and my mouth went dry. It wasn't just my imagination working overtime, it was visceral, like a physical weight pressing on me. The dogs were still barking, but they hadn't gone into full panic mode, which was strange. If there was a predator or someone dangerous around, they should have been going crazy, especially Bruno, my aunt's German Shepherd mix, who's usually hyperprotective. They seemed alert but not terrified. I kept scanning the tree line, which was maybe 50 yards from where I'd parked. The foliage was thick, perfect cover for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, studying, waiting. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. What if the small thing I saw wasn't alone? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if there was something bigger out there? Something waiting? I remembered all the stories I'd heard growing up in Washington, Bigfoot country. I'd always laughed them off as campfire tales. But sitting there, with sweat beading on my forehead despite the evening cooling down, those stories didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. I called out to the dogs through the open window. "Hey, Bruno, Maggie, you guys okay?" They looked over at me, still barking intermittently, but made no move to approach the truck. That was weird too. Usually they'd come running when I arrived. 5 minutes passed with me, just sitting there, engine running, watching the tree line and feeling increasingly uneasy. I called my girlfriend, trying to sound casual as I asked if she'd heard from my aunt today. She hadn't. I didn't mention what I'd seen. How could I without sounding crazy? I just said I was at my aunt's place checking on the dogs, that everything seemed fine, but that I might come back tomorrow instead. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You sound strange." "Yeah, just tired," I lied. "Been a long day." The whole time we talked, I couldn't stop scanning the trees. That feeling of being watched hadn't diminished at all. If anything, it had intensified. I decided the dogs had food and water from this morning. They'd be fine until tomorrow. I'd come back in daylight, preferably with someone else. I put the truck in reverse, keeping my eyes on that tree line the entire time. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being observed remained so strong, I could practically feel eyes boring into me. As I backed down the driveway, the dogs finally quieted down. I turned around at the end and headed back to the main road, glancing constantly in my rear-view mirror. Nothing followed me, at least nothing I could see, but that feeling of being watched stayed with me for miles. Only when I was back on the highway, with other cars around me and the forest well behind, did I finally start to relax. I stayed up late that night, searching online for any similar sightings in the Elmer area. There were a few vague reports from over the years, nothing recent, nothing specific. But the descriptions of juvenile Sasquatch, the height, the reddish-brown hair, the natural bipedal movement, matched what I'd seen with eerie accuracy. I called my friend Jake the next morning and asked if he'd come with me to check on my aunt's dogs. I didn't tell him why exactly, just that I'd seen something weird out there and didn't want to go alone. Jake's the kind of guy who's always up for anything, no questions asked, which is exactly what I needed. We arrived around noon. Everything looked completely normal in the daylight. The dogs were fine, greeting us with their usual enthusiasm. Jake and I walked the property, looking for tracks or disturbed areas where the creature might have passed through. We found nothing conclusive, just some broken twigs and flattened grass near where I thought I'd seen it emerge from the woods, but that could have been from anything. "So, what exactly did you see out here?" Jake finally asked as we checked behind the garage. I hesitated, then gave him a watered-down version. Something darted across the yard. Too big for a raccoon, moved wrong for a deer. Probably nothing, but it spooked me. He looked at me skeptically, but didn't push it. We finished checking the property, fed the dogs, and left without incident. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the strange light of dusk and an overactive imagination had combined to create a hallucination. But I know what I saw. That small, hair-covered figure, moving with such purpose and speed on two legs, wasn't any animal native to these woods. Its movements were too deliberate, too controlled, and that feeling of being watched afterward was too intense to dismiss. The way I see it, there are a few possibilities. Maybe it was a juvenile Bigfoot, as crazy as that sounds to say out loud. The size fits reports I've read about younger Sasquatch. And if it was a juvenile, that would explain the watching feeling. A protective adult nearby, hidden in the trees, observing but not revealing itself. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I don't have a name for. Either way, I can't explain it, and I can't forget it. I've been back to my aunt's place many times since then. Nothing like that has happened again. The dogs never showed any lingering signs of stress or fear. Life went on as normal. Sometimes I almost convince myself it never happened. But then I'll be driving that stretch of road as the sun is setting, and I'll slow down near that patch of woods. The feeling returns. That prickling awareness of unseen eyes, that sense that something is there in the shadows between the trees, watching and waiting. And I know with absolute certainty that what I saw was real. Whatever it was, it moved through this world with the confidence of something that belongs here, something that knows these forests far better than we do, something that's learned to stay hidden, except for those rare moments when our paths unexpectedly cross. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story, but I know what I saw that evening in July 2018, and it's changed how I see the woods around here. They're deeper now, more mysterious, and sometimes, when I'm driving past a particularly dense patch of forest, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if something might be scanning back. Story 8. In Detroit, I was 10 years old, staying at my aunt and uncle's place near Glenwood, Arkansas. They had this little house out in the sticks where I'd spend a couple weeks every summer. My cousins lived about a quarter-mile down the road, and I'd usually walk over to play with them after breakfast. That particular morning, it was early July, I think, the air was already sticky with humidity, even though it was only around 8 o'clock. My aunt had fixed pancakes, and I was eager to get over to my cousin's place because they'd gotten an Atari Pong system. I remember being so excited about it that I didn't even wait for my uncle to offer me a ride. I just announced I was heading over and bolted out the door. The road between our houses was this narrow gravel thing, more like a lane really, with dense woods on one side and a series of small clearings and pastures on the other. As I was walking, I noticed something moving along the fence line in one of these clearings to my left. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just one of the neighbor's cows or something, right? But something made me stop and take a better look. What I saw next has stayed with me my whole life. I immediately knew it wasn't a cow. It wasn't any animal I recognized at all. Moving along the barbed wire fence at the edge of this clearing was this figure. This tall white figure walking upright on two legs. I froze in place, not sure if I should run or hide. Some instinct made me crouch behind this old tree stump at the side of the road. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking, and I had this weird feeling like I couldn't swallow properly. The thing, and I have no other word for it, was walking steadily along the fence line. It was moving from east to west, from one tree line across the clearing toward another. The clearing had this small pond in it, and the creature was just skirting around the edge of it, following the fence. What struck me most was its color. It was completely white, but not like paper white. The hair, and I'm certain it was covered in hair, had this weird silvery sheen to it. When the morning sun hit it just right, it almost looked like aluminum foil. I've never seen anything like it before or since. I remember trying to judge how tall it was using the fence as reference. The barbed wire fence was about 4 feet high. I know because my uncle had made me help him repair it once, and he'd told me the height. This thing towered over that fence. If I had to guess, it was between 8 and 10 feet tall, maybe even taller, but it wasn't bulky like you might expect from something that size. It was lean, almost lanky. Its proportions were weird. Arms seemed longer than they should be, but it's hard to be sure at that distance. It moved smoothly, though, with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. The way it walked was so human-like, I guess. It wasn't lumbering or swaying side to side like a bear walking on its hind legs. It had this upright posture that reminded me of a person, but obviously it wasn't a person. No human is that tall or moves quite like that. I stayed hidden behind that stump, barely breathing, watching it cross the entire clearing. It never seemed to notice me, thank God, and it didn't seem agitated or in a hurry, just moving steadily along like it was on some kind of patrol or journey. I couldn't make out any facial features or see its hands clearly. The distance was too great, and it was slightly angled away from me. The whole thing probably lasted maybe 2 minutes at most, but it felt like forever. Eventually, it disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the clearing. I stayed frozen for what must have been another 5 minutes, afraid it might come back, or that something else might happen. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I ran all the way to my cousin's house without looking back once. My legs felt like jelly, and I was out of breath when I got there, but I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't tell anyone for years. At the time, I thought nobody would believe me. I was just a kid, and even I knew that what I'd seen didn't make sense. I knew about Bigfoot from TV shows and stuff, but those were always described as dark brown or black. This thing was white, brilliantly, unnaturally white with that weird silver sheen. I didn't know what to make of it. The rest of that day was strange. We played with the pong game, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that white figure emerging from the trees. I remember making an excuse to stay the night at my cousin's, rather than walking back to my aunt and uncle's alone. My uncle came to pick me up the next day, and I remember scanning the clearing as we drove past, looking for any sign of disturbance or tracks, but there was nothing obvious from the car. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake, listening for sounds outside my window. Back home in Little Rock, I started reading everything I could find about Bigfoot and strange creatures, but nothing quite matched what I'd seen. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I first heard about the possibility of white Sasquatch sightings. I was browsing through a book in a library and stumbled across a small paragraph mentioning color variations. My blood ran cold. All those years, I'd convinced myself that maybe I'd just seen some weird reflection or a person in a costume or something, but deep down, I knew better. The strangest thing is how consistent my memory of that morning has remained. Usually, childhood memories fade or get distorted over time, but not this one. The image of that tall, white figure with the silvery hair walking calmly along the fence line, that's as clear today as it was in '76. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was there, if it chose not to look my way. I've thought about going back to that area, maybe trying to find that clearing again, but I've never worked up the nerve. Part of me doesn't want to know if it's still out there. The logical part of my brain has always tried to explain it away. Could it have been some kind of albino bear? No way. The posture and movement were all wrong. A person in a costume? Out in the middle of nowhere at 8 in the morning? And no costume could account for that height without being obviously fake, especially to a kid who was used to seeing things like that on TV. I've wondered if maybe it was some escaped exotic animal, but nothing fits. The closest I've come to an explanation is what people now call a white Sasquatch or Bigfoot, But even that doesn't sit right with me. It wasn't bulky or muscular like most Bigfoot descriptions. It was tall and lean, almost graceful in a way. What's always bothered me most was how normal it all seemed in the moment. There was this impossible creature walking through a clearing, and it felt as ordinary as watching a deer or a fox go about its business. There was no drama to it, no cinematic moment where it turned and roared or anything like that. It was just there, going somewhere with purpose, existing in a world I thought I understood. I've tried drawing what I saw a few times over the years, but I'm not much of an artist. Nothing I put on paper ever captures the actual presence of the thing, that combination of impossible size, strange coloration, and natural movement. For years, I didn't tell anyone. By the time I was a teenager, I'd almost convinced myself it was just an overactive imagination. But sometimes I'd wake up from dreams where I was back on that road, watching that white figure, and I'd know it wasn't made up. I finally told my wife about 10 years ago. We were camping, and something about the woods at night loosened my tongue. She believed me, or at least she believed that I believed it. She's the one who encouraged me to look into similar sightings. That's how I eventually found communities like this one, where people share experiences that don't fit neatly into what we're supposed to see in the world. What strikes me now, looking back, is how calm I felt during parts of the encounter. There was fear, sure, but also this strange sense of, I don't know, privilege maybe? Like I was seeing something rare and significant, something most people go their whole lives without witnessing. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd called out to it, or if it had noticed me there. Would it have charged, run away, tried to communicate somehow? There's a part of me that regrets not knowing, but a bigger part that's grateful I stayed hidden. My uncle sold that property in the early 80s, and I haven't been back to that exact area since. I've driven through Glenwood a couple of times over the years, and every time I get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I find myself scanning the tree lines, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something white moving between the trunks. I'm 58 now, and I've had a pretty normal life, all things considered. College, career, marriage, kids. But that summer morning has colored everything. It taught me that the world is stranger than we're led to believe, that there are things out there that don't fit into our neat categories. I've never had another sighting or anything close to it. Sometimes I wonder if that makes it more or less believable. If I were the type to make things up, wouldn't I have seen it again or seen other impossible things? Instead, it was just this one inexplicable moment, this brief window into something that shouldn't exist but clearly did. The detail about the silver sheen to its white hair is what I come back to most often. It was so distinctive, so unlike any animal I've ever seen or heard of. Sometimes when I see Christmas tinsel catch the light a certain way, it brings me right back to that morning. I don't expect people to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told me the same story. But it happened. That white figure was real, moving along that fence line in the early morning light. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in the woods, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'm being watched by something that isn't supposed to exist. For anyone else who's had a similar experience, especially involving a white one, I'd be curious to hear your story. For nearly 50 years, I've been trying to make sense of what I saw that day, and I'm no closer to an answer now than I was when I was 10 years old, crouched behind that stump, watching something impossible move through the ordinary world. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this story for weeks now. Every time I start typing, my hands shake so badly I have to stop. Even after all these years, the memories flood back like it happened yesterday. I need to get this off my chest, though. Maybe someone here will believe me or at least understand why I've spent my life avoiding certain parts of the Idaho wilderness. This happened back in 1842. I was 32 years old then, experienced in the ways of the wilderness but not prepared for what I encountered. My trapping partner James Whitfield and I had been working together for almost 4 seasons. James was a quiet man, skilled with traps and quick with a knife. He could skin a beaver cleaner than anyone I'd ever met, and he knew the rivers and valleys better than most natives. We trusted each other completely, which is essential when you're isolated in the wilderness for months at a time. That spring, we decided to try our luck in the territory between the Salmon River and the Wisdom River, near what's now Grangeville. The area was known for its rich beaver population, and we'd heard promising things from other trappers. Seemed like the perfect spot to make enough money to see us through the next winter. We'd been there about 2 weeks, setting up a base camp and establishing our trap lines. Everything had been going well. We'd already collected 16 beaver pelts and spotted signs of plenty more. The weather had been unusually pleasant, and game was plentiful. I remember thinking how fortunate we were. That morning started like any other. We split up after breakfast. James went northeast to check traps along a small creek, while I headed west to set new ones along the main river. I remember the day was bright and clear, with just enough chill in the morning air to keep a man alert. I spent several hours wading through cold water, setting and baiting traps, making mental notes of beaver sign. I returned to camp around mid-afternoon, expecting to find James already there preparing a late lunch. What I found instead stopped me cold. Our camp was destroyed, not just disturbed, but systematically torn apart. The canvas tarp we'd stretched between trees was ripped down. Our packs had been opened, their contents scattered everywhere. The pot of beans we'd left simmering on the coals was upended, its contents spilled across the stones. What disturbed me most were the tracks. Huge, unlike anything I'd seen before. They weren't bear tracks. I've tracked plenty of bears in my time. These were different, almost like a man's but impossibly large, with 5 distinct toe marks. I stood there gripping my rifle, scanning the tree line, when James emerged from the woods. He stopped short when he saw the destruction, his face hardening. "What in God's name happened here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Found it like this. Look at these tracks." James crouched down, examining the impressions in the soft earth. He ran his fingers along the edges, his brow furrowing deeper. "Not a bear," he murmured. "Not a wolf either." "Mountain lion," I suggested, knowing full well it wasn't. "Never seen a cat leave tracks like these," James replied, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. We spent the rest of the daylight hours rebuilding our camp, constructing a sturdier lean-to with fallen logs and our remaining canvas. Neither of us said much, but I know we were both thinking the same thing. We should leave. But 16 pelts wasn't enough to justify the trip, and our supplies had cost us nearly everything we had. We couldn't afford to turn back empty-handed. That night, we built the fire higher than usual and took shifts keeping watch. I had the first watch and sat with my back to the fire, rifle across my lap, staring into the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no owls, no night creatures rustling in the underbrush, just silence, heavy and oppressive. I woke James for his shift around midnight and fell into an uneasy sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I jerked awake, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. Something had crashed into our lean-to, sending branches and canvas collapsing onto us. I scrambled for my rifle as James shouted in alarm. The smell hit me first, a powerful, rank animal odor, unlike anything I'd encountered before. It was like wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something musky and primitive that triggered something deep in my brain, screaming danger. Through the collapsed shelter, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the darkness beyond our fire. It stood upright, silhouetted against the trees, impossibly tall. I fired a shot more out of panic than aim, and the figure disappeared into the forest with surprising speed for something so large. "Did you see it?" James gasped, fighting his way free of the collapsed shelter. "Not clearly," I admitted, reloading my rifle with shaking hands, "but it was big, walked on 2 legs. We stayed awake until dawn, huddled by the rekindled fire, our rifles ready. As first light filtered through the trees, we examined our camp again. New tracks, identical to the ones from yesterday, surrounded our destroyed shelter. They came right up to where we'd been sleeping. "We need to leave," James said, his face ashen in the morning light. I nodded. "One more day, just to check the traps we've already set. We can't afford to leave them." James didn't look happy, but he agreed. We needed those pelts. We spent the morning rebuilding our camp again, this time making a more substantial structure with larger logs. We fashioned crude alarms, strings of tin cups and plates salvaged from our supplies, strung around the perimeter. After a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, we separated to check our trap lines, agreeing to meet back at camp before sunset. The forest felt different that day. I've spent most of my life in the wilderness, and I know when something's not right. The birds were quiet. The small game was scarce. Even the insects seemed subdued. Every snapping twig made me spin around, rifle raised. I collected 4 beaver from my traps, working as quickly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. I was making my way back to camp when I heard it, a long, low moan that echoed across the valley. It wasn't the call of any animal I recognized. It was harsh and grating, almost like a man in pain, but deeper, more guttural. It came from the hill opposite our camp, and it froze me in my tracks. I stood motionless for several minutes, listening, but it didn't come again. When I finally reached camp, my heart sank. Once again, our shelter was demolished, but this time with much greater violence. Logs that had taken both of us to position were splintered and thrown dozens of yards away. Our packs were not just opened but torn to shreds. Even more disturbing, our pelts were gone, all of them. 3 weeks of work vanished. James wasn't there. I called his name, trying to keep my voice steady, but the only response was the wind through the trees. I checked the position of the sun, at least 2 hours until sunset. James should have been back by now. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to go looking for him, but I knew separating wasn't wise. Whatever was hunting us, and I was certain now that we were being hunted, seemed to be growing bolder. I decided to rebuild a small fire and wait. James knew these woods. He'd find his way back. As I gathered wood, I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder, stopping every few minutes to scan the surroundings. That's when I heard the moan again, closer this time, from the direction James had gone that morning. It was followed by a sound that still haunts my nightmares, a high, thin scream that could only have come from a human throat. James. I started running toward the sound. Caution forgotten, I crashed through underbrush, splashed across the creek, calling James's name. The forest had gone silent again, except for my own desperate shouts. After about 20 minutes of frantic searching, I realized I was being foolish. The sound could have carried from anywhere in the valley. I was more likely to get myself lost or separated than to find James. I made my way back to camp, moving more cautiously now. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I rebuilt a small fire and waited, hoping James would appear at any moment with some explanation for his delay. As darkness fell, I heard rustling in the undergrowth. I raised my rifle, heart pounding. "James!" I called. The bushes parted, and James staggered into the clearing. Relief flooded through me until I saw his face. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It followed me," he gasped. "All day, staying just out of sight, making those sounds." He collapsed beside the fire, hands shaking so badly he could barely accept the water I offered him. "Did you see it clearly?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just glimpses. It's big, Marcus. Bigger than any man I've ever seen. And it moves like nothing I've encountered before." We decided then and there to leave at first light. We'd salvage what we could and head back to civilization. The pelts weren't worth our lives. We took turns sleeping that night, but I doubt either of us actually got any rest. Every sound from the forest had us clutching our rifles. Just before dawn, that moaning call came again, this time from the hill directly opposite our camp. It was answered by another call from behind us. There were two of them. "They're coordinating," James whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Like wolves." As soon as there was enough light to see, we began packing what little remained of our supplies. We worked quickly, barely speaking, both jumping at every sound from the forest. "I'll finish checking my trap line," I said, securing my pack. "No sense leaving good traps behind. You get everything ready here. I'll be back in 2 hours, and we'll leave immediately." James looked uncertain. "We should stay together." 2 hours, I insisted. "Those traps are worth more than the pelts we've lost. We can't afford to abandon them." Reluctantly, James agreed. I set off with my rifle and a small pack, moving quickly along my trap line, collecting the few remaining traps. I found one more beaver, but I didn't bother skinning it. There was no time. I just wanted to collect my property and get out of that valley as quickly as possible. It took me longer than expected. Some of the traps had shifted in the current, requiring me to wade deeper into the cold river to retrieve them. By the time I collected the last one, the sun was higher than I'd intended. I hurried back toward camp, my pack heavy with iron traps. As I approached our clearing, something felt wrong. It was too quiet. The fire James should have been tending was just smoldering coals. "James," I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No answer. I moved cautiously into the clearing. Our remaining supplies were neatly packed, ready for travel. James's horse was still tethered nearby, grazing peacefully, but James himself was... I still have trouble writing this part. James was lying face down beside the packs. At first, I thought he was resting. Then I saw the unnatural angle of his head. I rushed to him, turned him over. His neck was broken, not just broken, twisted almost completely around. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and there on his throat were 4 distinct puncture marks, like enormous fangs had pierced his flesh. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. That's when I saw the tracks. They came from the forest behind where James had been working. The creature had come up silently from behind, struck him down, and then... What? The tracks showed it had stayed there, standing over his body for some time. The realization of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. This thing, whatever it was, had deliberately picked us off when we separated. It had intelligence. It had been stalking us, learning our patterns, waiting for an opportunity. I didn't take time to bury James. May God forgive me for that. Terror overwhelmed any other consideration. I grabbed my rifle, mounted my pony, and rode out of that valley as fast as the animal could carry me, leaving behind everything else, the traps, the supplies, and my friend's body. I rode without stopping until I reached the nearest settlement 2 days later. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but I could tell from their faces they didn't believe me. They sent a party to recover James's body, but when they returned, they said they found nothing. No body, no camp, not even tracks, just wilderness. I never returned to trapping, never went back to that part of Idaho. I took work in a general store in Montana and eventually saved enough to buy it when the owner retired. I married, had children, lived what most would call a normal life. But I've never forgotten. Sometimes I still wake in the night, heart pounding, the smell of that creature fresh in my nostrils. I hear that grating moan echoing across the valley. I see James's broken body, those fang marks on his throat. Whatever killed James wasn't a bear or wolf or any natural predator. It hunted us deliberately, intelligently. It destroyed our camp twice, stole our pelts, separated us, and then struck when one of us was vulnerable. I don't know what to call it. The locals have their stories. Wild men, forest devils, Sasquatch. I don't know what name fits. I just know what I experienced. And I know that even now, 80 years later, I still can't close my eyes without seeing those massive footprints in the soft earth of that Idaho valley. Story 10. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. Even now, 70 years after that day, my hands shake as I write this. I was just a boy of 9 when my grandfather, William Hamilton, first confided in me what he saw that March morning in 1851. He made me swear never to speak of it until after his passing, fearing folks would think our family touched in the head. Now that I'm an old man myself, I reckon it's time the truth was known. My grandfather wasn't the type for tall tales. A God-fearing man who served as deacon in our church for 30 years, he was known throughout Greene County as honest to a fault. Which is why what happened to him and Thomas Becker that day tormented him so, not just the terror of what they saw, but the ridicule they faced afterward. It was early March, still cold enough that your breath hung in the air like smoke. Grandfather and Thomas had set out before dawn to track deer. Winter had been harsh that year, and the family smokehouse needed restocking. They'd been friends since before Arkansas was even a state, served together in the militia, and trusted each other with their lives. They'd been tracking a promising buck for about 3 hours, heading deeper into the hills than they typically ventured. The forest there was older, with trees so massive 2 men couldn't join hands around them. Grandfather always said there was something different about those woods, quieter, as if the birds and small creatures knew to stay away. We'd just come upon a small clearing, he told me, his voice dropping to a whisper, even though we were alone in his workshop. The kind where deer like to graze when the sun hits just right. Thomas was leading, and he suddenly stopped so quick I near ran into him. He didn't say a word, just pointed. At first, Grandfather thought they'd found their deer, but what caught Thomas's eye was a small herd of cattle. Strange to find so deep in the woods. They weren't wild either. They had brands, which meant they'd wandered from someone's homestead. But it wasn't the cattle that made Thomas freeze. Something was stalking them. At first I thought it might be a bear, Grandfather said. We'd had trouble with them taking livestock before, but this was no bear. From the edge of the clearing, a massive figure emerged. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but stood nearly 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, thick as a buffalo's winter coat. But what struck my grandfather most was its head, crowned with long, flowing locks that covered its neck and shoulders like a lion's mane. The cattle sensed it before they saw it, he recalled, his eyes distant with memory. They began lowing and shifting, but they were hemmed in by a fallen tree on one side. That thing, it was smart. It had driven them there deliberately, cutting off their escape. Thomas and Grandfather were downwind, hidden by a thicket of young pines. They watched, frozen in place, as the creature moved with purpose toward the frightened cattle. It didn't lumber or shamble like a bear might. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful, despite its massive size. Then it happened, Grandfather said, his voice cracking. One of the branches under Thomas's foot snapped. Wasn't loud, barely more than a twig breaking, but in that silence it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature stopped. The cattle bolted, scattering in panic, but the beast paid them no mind. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward the sound. Those eyes, Grandfather whispered. Lord help me, I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They had knowing in them. Intelligence. It looked right at us, Thomas, right through us. For what felt like an eternity, they stood locked in that gaze. Grandfather said he couldn't have moved if his life depended on it. His muscles had turned to stone, his blood to ice in his veins. Thomas later admitted he'd wet himself, standing there under that creature's stare. Then, with deliberate slowness, the beast turned away. It seemed almost contemptuous, as if they weren't worth its time. Then it moved, and God Almighty how it moved. One moment it was there, the next it was 20 yards away, Grandfather recalled. It didn't run like any creature I've ever seen. Each bound covered 12, maybe 14 feet. It cleared fallen logs like they were nothing. Within seconds it had disappeared into the forest. Only then did Thomas and Grandfather remember to breathe. Thomas's hands were shaking so badly he dropped his rifle. Grandfather couldn't feel his legs, but some mad curiosity, or perhaps the need to prove to themselves they hadn't gone insane, drove them to follow. The tracks were plain as day in the soft ground, Grandfather said. Bigger than my hand, with 5 toes splayed out like a man's, but the arch and ball much larger, designed for power. We followed them nearly a mile, moving slow and careful, both of us knowing full well we didn't want to actually catch up to whatever made them. The trail led to a swift-running stream. On the other side, nothing, not a single track, not a broken branch, as if the creature had simply vanished. That's when Thomas said what we'd both been thinking, Grandfather told me. "Bill," he said, "what in God's name did we just see?" They made their way back to town in silence, each lost in his thoughts. They agreed to speak to Sheriff Davis, not because they expected him to do anything, but because they felt a duty to warn people something dangerous was in the woods. The sheriff listened patiently, then asked if they'd been drinking. When they insisted they were sober, he suggested maybe they'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs, or possibly a mountain lion in strange light. When they described the creature's mane, its human-like gait and impossible leaping ability, his patience wore thin. "He told us to go home and sleep it off," Grandfather said bitterly. Then the next day at the general store, we overheard him telling Jasper Williams we'd come in with some wild story about a man-beast in the woods. By Sunday, half the town was laughing about it. Only it wasn't funny when Abraham Fletcher lost 3 calves the following week. In the days that followed, other farmers reported missing livestock. Jacob Thornton lost 2 sheep. The widow Parker found her chicken coop destroyed, with tracks around it that weren't right. Old man Kavanaugh swore he heard something on his roof one night, something heavy that moved like a man. But no one connected these incidents to what Grandfather and Thomas had seen. It was easier to blame wolves or bears or mountain lions, creatures they understood. "Thomas and I went back out there," Grandfather admitted. "Armed better this time, with 3 other men who believed us enough to help. We searched for days, covered every inch of those woods for miles around, found nothing, not a track, not a hair." He leaned forward then, his eyes suddenly intense. "But it found us. The last night, camped by the stream where we'd lost the trail, I woke up feeling watched. The fire had burned low, and the others were sleeping. I sat up, and there it was, just at the edge of the light, standing still as a statue, watching us, watching me." Grandfather said he reached slowly for his rifle, never breaking eye contact with the creature. It knew what I was doing, I swear it knew. And it smiled. Not like a man smiles, but its lips pulled back, showing teeth. Then it melted back into the darkness. I sat there till dawn, rifle across my knees, too terrified to wake the others or to sleep. When they returned to town empty-handed, the ridicule grew worse. People began avoiding Grandfather and Thomas, crossing the street when they saw them coming. The minister took Grandfather aside after service and gently suggested that perhaps his mind had been playing tricks on him, that Satan sometimes sent visions to confuse the faithful. "Only Thomas understood," Grandfather said. "Only Thomas believed me because he'd seen it too. We stopped talking about it eventually. Had to, for the sake of our families. But we never stopped believing what we saw." The strange livestock losses continued sporadically for about a month, then stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Life in Greene County returned to normal. People forgot or pretended to, but Grandfather never did. "Sometimes, even now, I wake up feeling watched," he told me, his voice barely audible. "I'll look to the window expecting to see those eyes staring back at me, and sometimes, God help me, I think I do." He made me promise that night never to go into those particular woods alone, a promise I've kept all my life, even when friends mock me for taking the long way around. Thomas Becker died in 1876 of pneumonia. In his fever, They say he raved about a creature with a mane that walked like a man. The doctor put it down to delirium. Grandfather passed 10 years later. To his dying day, he maintained what they'd seen was real. I'm an old man now, with grandchildren of my own. I've never seen the creature myself, though there have been stories over the years. Hunters gone missing, strange sounds in the night, livestock disappearing without a trace. Most folks attribute them to natural causes or tall tales. But last summer, my oldest grandson came running home from a fishing trip, white as a sheet. He'd seen something by the old stream, he said. Something watching him from the trees. Something with a mane like a lion that walked like a man. I believed him. I had to. Because 70 years ago, my grandfather looked me in the eye and told me this same story. And I knew then, as I know now, that he was telling the truth. I don't know what lives in the forests of Greene County. I don't know if it's still there or if it ever moved on. I don't know if it's some undiscovered animal or something else. All I know is what my grandfather and Thomas Becker saw that March morning in 1851 was real. And sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear something moving outside my window. Something heavy, something that breathes almost like a man, and I don't dare look. Story 11. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family. It's the account of my great-grandfather, Jonathan Pierce, written in his journal after what happened to him in 1856. I found it in my grandmother's attic last month, and I still get chills reading it. I've transcribed it exactly as he wrote it, and I swear every word is true. This morning marks 2 weeks since that thing attacked me, and my hands still shake when I try to write. Doc Miller says I should put it all down on paper, says it'll help settle my mind. I ain't so sure about that, but nightmares keep me up most nights, so I reckon I'll try anything. It was early October, harvest time. I was 33 years old then, working as a deputy under Sheriff Jackson Wilkes in Caddo County. Good man, the sheriff. Tough but fair. The trouble started when old man Thibodeau lost 3 sheep in one night. Clean gone, with just some blood and weird tracks left behind. Next night, the widow Jenkins lost a cow. Then the Martins lost 2 pigs and found their dog torn up something awful. Folks were scared. Started talking about wolves, maybe a bear. But I'd tracked plenty of both, and these weren't no normal animal tracks. They looked almost like a man's footprint, but bigger, much bigger, and with what looked like claws at the toes. Sheriff Wilkes called me to his office on the morning of October 9th. 4 other men were already there. Micah Blackwood, the best tracker in the county, brothers Tom and Samuel Henderson, local farmers who could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 paces, and Doc Miller, who insisted on coming along in case whatever was out there had attacked someone. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Wilkes said, "something's been terrorizing our community, and we're gonna put an end to it." That's when he told us about the reports from farmers on the western edge of the parish. Not just livestock going missing, but sightings too. A huge, hairy, man-like creature lurking in the woods. Most folks laughed it off as superstition, but not after what old man Thibodeau said he saw carrying off his sheep, a massive, hairy beast walking on 2 legs. We set out that same day, each of us on horseback, rifles loaded. I rode my stallion Thunder, strongest horse in the parish and smart as a whip. We followed the trail west, toward the dense cypress swamps where the Henderson brothers had found strange tracks 3 days prior. The first day passed uneventfully. We made camp near a creek, took turns keeping watch. I remember feeling uneasy that night, like something was watching us from the darkness beyond our fire. The others felt it too. Even the horses were restless, nickering softly and pulling at their tethers. Dawn broke cold and misty on the second day. We ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and jerky, then mounted up to continue the search. Micah found fresh tracks near the creek, the same strange, oversized footprints heading deeper into the swamp. "Never seen anything like it," Micah muttered, crouching by a track in the soft mud. "Too big for a man, but it ain't no bear neither. We followed those tracks all morning, pushing our horses through increasingly difficult terrain. By midday, we'd reached a part of the swamp few people ever ventured into. The cypress trees grew so thick here that they blocked out most of the sunlight, and the ground was a treacherous mix of mud and water. Around 3 o'clock, we found the remains of a deer. Fresh kill, torn apart, but not eaten like a predator would, just destroyed. That's the only word for it. Something had ripped that deer to pieces out of pure meanness. "Whatever did this ain't natural," Samuel Henderson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Wilkes ordered us to spread out but stay within shouting distance. I headed northeast, following what looked like drag marks through the underbrush. The air was thick and still. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence, heavy and unnatural. That's when I smelled it. A stench like nothing I'd ever encountered before, like rotting meat and sour milk and something else I can't even describe. Thunder smelled it too and started acting skittish, tossing his head and snorting. "Easy, boy," I whispered, patting his neck, trying to keep him calm while I scanned the trees around us. I was about to call out to the others when I saw movement about 50 yards ahead. Just a flash of dark brown among the grey-green cypress trunks. I raised my rifle, squinting to see better in the dim light. And then, it happened so fast, I still can't piece it all together properly. The thing, and God help me, I don't know what else to call it, burst from the trees directly in front of us. Thunder reared in panic, and I nearly lost my grip on the rifle. I caught just a glimpse of it before chaos erupted. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, covered in dark, matted hair, with arms that hung almost to its knees. But its face, Lord above, its face is what haunts me still. Not quite human, not quite animal. Eyes set deep and dark, reflecting the dim light like a cat's. A broad, flat nose and a mouthful of teeth that no man should have. It let out a sound that froze my blood. Not a roar, not a scream, but something in between. Then it charged. I fired my rifle, but in my panic, the shot went wide. Before I could reload, the creature reached us. One massive hand grabbed Thunder's bridle while the other seized my leg. The strength of it. It yanked me from the saddle like I was no more than a rag doll, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I heard the others shouting, heard more gunshots, but they sounded far away. The thing loomed over me, blocking out what little light filtered through the trees. I tried to scramble away, but it grabbed my ankle and dragged me backward through the mud. I clawed at the ground, grabbed at roots and vines, anything to stop it from pulling me deeper into the swamp. My fingers were bleeding, nails torn. I screamed for help, but my voice seemed small and useless in that vast darkness. The creature flipped me onto my back and I got my first clear look at it, 7 feet tall at least, maybe more, with shoulders broader than any man's. Its eyes, God, those eyes. They weren't mindless like an animal's. There was intelligence there and hatred and something else I couldn't name. It dropped onto my chest, knocking the breath from me again. The weight of it was crushing. I could feel my ribs creaking under the pressure. Then it lowered its face to mine, so close I could feel its hot breath, smell the blood and rot on it. I thought it would tear out my throat right then, but instead, it studied me, like it was curious. One massive hand pressed against my chest, pinning me down, while the other touched my face, almost gently. Those fingers were tipped with claws, thick and yellow and sharp as knives. Then, without warning, it raked those claws across my face. The pain was blinding. I felt my skin tear open, felt the blood pour hot down my cheek and neck. I thrashed and fought, but it was like fighting a mountain. It slashed again, this time across my chest, shredding my shirt and the flesh beneath. I heard more gunshots, closer now. The creature's head snapped up like a dog hearing its master's call. For a moment, it seemed distracted. I seized my chance and drove my knee up as hard as I could between its legs. I don't know if it felt pain like a man would, but it grunted and shifted its weight just enough for me to roll to the side. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling and slipping in the mud, my face and chest burning like fire. The others were shouting, getting closer. The creature turned toward their voices, then back to me. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then it did something I still can't explain. It grinned, not an animal baring its teeth, but a deliberate, human-like smile that chilled me more than anything else it had done. It turned away from me, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. But it didn't flee into the swamp as I expected. Instead, it went straight for Thunder, who was still nearby, trembling and wild-eyed. In one fluid motion, the creature vaulted onto my horse's back. Thunder bucked and reared, but the thing held on, gripping with its powerful legs. It grabbed the reins with hands that shouldn't have been able to use them. But it did, yanking Thunder's head around and kicking him into motion. And then, God help me, I swear this is true, it rode away. Rode my horse like a man would, hunched forward, those long arms handling the reins with unnatural skill. The last I saw of it was its massive, hair-covered back disappearing into the cypress trees, mounted on my own horse. Sheriff Wilkes and the others found me moments later, half-conscious and bleeding badly. Doc Miller patched me up as best he could there in the swamp, but said I needed proper care back in town. The gashes were deep. I would later learn they needed over 60 stitches all told, and even then, the scars would be with me forever. They told me they'd heard my shot and my screams, but the swamp had played tricks with the sound. They'd been running in circles trying to find me. When I told them what happened, about the creature riding off on Thunder, I could see the disbelief in their eyes, though they were too kind to say it. "You lost a lot of blood, John," Doc Miller said gently. "Mind plays tricks when that happens." But I know what I saw. And when we made our way back through the swamp the next day, me riding double with Tom Henderson, we found Thunder's tracks heading deep into territory no sane person would venture. The sheriff wanted to follow, but Doc insisted I needed medical attention that couldn't wait. They brought me back to town where Doc stitched me up proper. The fever set in that night. Infection from the creature's filthy claws. For 3 days, I hovered between life and death, burning up and raving, seeing that thing's face every time I closed my eyes. When the fever broke, I learned that Sheriff Wilkes had organized a larger hunting party and gone back out. They searched for a week but found nothing. No tracks, no sign of the creature, no remains of my horse. It was like it had all vanished into thin air. That was 2 weeks ago. The wounds on my face and chest are healing, but they'll leave scars that'll mark me for life. Some folks in town have started calling the creature the Caddo Rider on account of it stealing my horse. Others say I imagined the whole thing, that I was attacked by a bear and my mind made up the rest. But I know what I saw, and sometimes in the deepest part of the night I think I hear hoofbeats outside my window. And once, just once, I swear I caught that same foul stench on the night air and heard something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal moving around my house. Sheriff Wilkes says I should come back to work when I'm healed up, that having something to do will keep my mind off what happened. But I don't think I'll ever set foot in those swamps again, and sometimes I catch myself wondering if that thing is still out there, riding my thunder through the dark places where people don't go. Folks around here have been talking. Livestock still goes missing sometimes, always on the darkest nights. And just last week, the Miller boy swears he saw a huge, hairy thing riding a horse along the edge of the swamp at dusk. I don't know what that creature was. Don't know if it was some kind of wild man or something else I don't have words for, but I know it was smart. Smarter than any animal has a right to be. And I know that when it looked at me with those terrible eyes, it wasn't just hunting, it was hating. I keep a loaded rifle by my bed now, windows locked, doors barred. Because deep down, I know something else too. It let me live. Could have killed me easy, but it chose not to. And sometimes that scares me more than anything else. Why did it let me go? What was it thinking behind those eyes? And what does it want? Riding my stolen horse through the dark cypress swamps of Caddo County? I don't expect I'll ever know, but I'll carry the marks of its claws until the day I die. And every time I look in the mirror and see those scars, I'll remember the Caddo rider and wonder when, not if, but when, it'll come back. I've tried researching the Caddo rider since finding my great-grandfather's journal. There are still stories around here, passed down through generations. Some say it shows up every 40 years or so. The last reported sighting was in the 1970s, when 3 hunters claimed to see a large, hairy creature riding a horse through the swamp at night. My great-grandfather never returned to police work. He died in 1891, and family lore says that on the night he passed, several people in town reported hearing a horse galloping at full speed down the main street. But when they looked outside, there was nothing there. I don't know what to believe, but I keep a locked door and a loaded gun just in case. Some things are better not to take chances with. Story 12. In all my years trapping in the California wilderness, I've seen things most folks wouldn't believe. Bears the size of small cabins. Mountain lions that could stare a man's soul right out of his body. But what I encountered along the Trinity River in October of 1870 still haunts me to this day. I've never shared this account publicly, partly because I feared ridicule, partly because the memory itself makes my hands tremble even now, 40+ years later. The Trinity River Valley was prime trapping territory back then, before the logging companies moved in and the miners tore everything apart. I'd been working those woods for nearly 15 years by that point, knew every bend in the river, every game trail worth setting on. I was no greenhorn city boy. Zachariah Morgan, that's me, and I'd earned my reputation as one of the most knowledgeable trappers in Northern California. I set up my camp that autumn in a small clearing about 30 yards from the riverbank. Good spot. Defensible, close to water, and nestled beneath a stand of old-growth pines that would block the worst of the wind. Nothing fancy. Just my canvas tent, bedroll, a few supplies, and a stone-ringed fire pit I built myself. I'd been living off the land since I was 14, so setting up a proper camp was second nature. That first day went smoothly enough. I laid out my trap lines along the river and up into the surrounding hills. Beaver, marten, and fox were plentiful that year. The weather held fair, unseasonably warm for October. I remember feeling particularly satisfied with my work as I headed back to camp that evening, just as dusk was settling in. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. My carefully built fire pit had been dismantled, not just extinguished, mind you, but methodically taken apart. The stones I'd arranged in a circle were scattered, my cooking pot lay upended by my tent, and my provisions sack had been emptied, its contents strewn across the ground. At first I suspected bears, they're notorious camp raiders, but something felt off about the whole scene. Bears leave obvious signs, claw marks, crushed containers, trampled vegetation. This was different. The disarray felt deliberate, almost curious in nature. I rebuilt everything, cursing under my breath, and chalked it up to some drifter who'd happened upon my camp. Maybe a gold panner or another trapper with mischief on his mind. I relit my fire, reorganized my supplies, and kept my rifle closer than usual that night. The next day followed the same pattern. I left at dawn to check my traps, returning at dusk to find my camp once again in disarray. This time, though, my fire had been extinguished, but the stones remained in place. My tent had been partially collapsed, as if someone had been examining its structure. Nothing was missing, just rearranged, studied almost. By the third day, a creeping uneasiness had settled into my bones. Again, I returned to find my camp disturbed, but this time I noticed something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Tracks, enormous tracks pressed into the wet sand about 300 yards downstream from my camp. I've tracked every creature in these mountains, but these prints belonged to nothing I recognized. They resembled human footprints in their basic shape, but were easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. 5 toes, like a man's foot, but with strange indentations suggesting powerful, gripping appendages. The stride length between prints measured nearly 4 feet. Whoever or whatever made these tracks stood far taller than any man I'd ever encountered. That night, I barely slept. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind through the pines had me bolt upright, rifle in hand. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wouldn't be running off like some scared schoolboy. I'd spent too many years in these mountains to be chased away by whatever this was. I decided to skip my trapline checks the next day. Instead, I carefully arranged my camp as usual, built my fire, and left everything looking as if I'd gone about my regular business. But instead of heading upstream, I circled back through the woods and positioned myself in a dense thicket about 50 yards from my camp. I had clear sightlines to my tent and fire pit, but remained hidden amongst the underbrush. My Winchester rested across my knees, loaded and ready. Hours passed. The sun crept across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon turned to evening. My legs cramped from holding still for so long, but years of hunting had taught me patience. The forest around me carried on its usual business. Jays squawked, squirrels chattered, and occasionally a fish would jump in the river with a soft splash. Then everything went quiet. It wasn't a gradual silence. One moment the forest was alive with sound, the next, nothing. As if a blanket had been thrown over the entire valley. Even the constant gurgle of the river seemed muted somehow. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool evening air. That's when I heard it. A strange, shrill whistling coming from upstream, not like a bird call or wind through rocks, but deliberate, patterned, almost like signals. I tightened my grip on my rifle and waited, hardly daring to breathe. It emerged from between the trees on the opposite side of my camp, and "it" is the only word I can use, because in that first moment, my mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, but it was unlike any man or beast I'd ever encountered. Standing at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, its body proportions were all wrong. Broad, square shoulders topped a long torso, but its legs seemed oddly short for its height. Its arms hung down past its knees, unnaturally long and ending in hands, with what looked like powerful fingers. Most disturbing of all was its head, small relative to its body and seemingly attached directly to those massive shoulders without a discernible neck. And the hair, God Almighty, the hair. Its entire body was covered in a thick coat of cinnamon-colored fur, or hair, growing especially dense around its face. I could barely make out features beneath that growth, just the occasional glint of what might have been eyes, set deep and close together. I remained frozen, my finger hovering near the trigger but not on it. The creature didn't appear aggressive. Cautious would be a better word. It approached my camp slowly, head swiveling as if monitoring its surroundings. When it reached my fire pit, it stopped. For several long minutes it simply stood there, staring down at the flames. Then it did something I still struggle to comprehend. It reached down, moving with surprising grace for something so large, and carefully extracted a single burning stick from the fire. Holding it up, it began to wave the flaming branch back and forth, watching intently as the flames flickered and danced. When that stick's flame finally died out, it reached for another, repeating the process with what I can only describe as childlike fascination. One by one, it removed every burning piece of wood from my fire, waving each until it extinguished, methodically dismantling my campfire. When the last ember died, it made that whistling sound again, higher pitched this time, almost excited. To my utter astonishment, 3 more creatures emerged from the trees in response to that call. They were similar in appearance to the first, varying slightly in size and in the coloration of their hair, but unmistakably the same type of being. They approached without hesitation, gathering around the now cold fire pit. The first creature appeared to communicate with them through a series of low grunts and those whistling sounds. Then, to my amazement, it began rebuilding my fire, arranging the sticks exactly as they had been before, though without relighting them. What followed was one of the most extraordinary displays I've ever witnessed. The creatures took turns extracting sticks, examining them, and then returning them to the pit. When they'd exhausted their curiosity with the fire, they moved on to my tent, carefully exploring its structure, feeling the canvas, tugging gently at the ropes. One spent several minutes examining my cooking pot, turning it over repeatedly in its massive hands. Not once did they behave destructively. There was purpose and intelligence in their movements, a deliberate investigation of these strange human objects. They communicated constantly with those whistles and grunts, occasionally making gestures with their long arms. I remained hidden, my muscles screaming from holding still for so long, but fear and fascination kept me rooted to the spot. The rational part of my brain catalogued details, their movement patterns, their apparent social structure, the way they used those whistling sounds. The rest of me was simply terrified, confronted with something that defied all my understanding of the natural world. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 45 minutes, the largest of them made a distinct whistling call, and all four creatures straightened up. As if responding to a command, they moved away from my camp in single file, heading back toward the river. I watched them disappear into the trees, moving with a fluid, swinging gait that covered ground with astonishing efficiency. When I was certain they were gone, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my rifle. I wanted nothing more than to grab my essentials and flee, but something told me that running through unfamiliar forest at night would be foolish. Reluctantly, I returned to camp, rebuilt my fire, and spent a sleepless night with my back against a tree and my rifle across my lap. Over the next few weeks, the visitations continued. Not daily, but frequent enough to establish a pattern. They always came near dusk, always announced their presence with that whistling sound, and always focused their attention on my fire. I took to hiding and observing them, gradually moving my observation point closer as my fear gave way to curiosity. I began leaving out simple objects for them to examine: a metal cup, a wooden comb, pieces of colored cloth. They approached these offerings with the same methodical curiosity, often carrying the items a short distance away for closer examination before carefully returning them to where they'd found them. Once, I left my pocket watch, an old silver piece that had belonged to my father. The largest creature spent nearly 20 minutes with it, figuring out how to open the case and watching the second hand tick around the face. It eventually placed the watch back exactly where I'd left it, but positioned a smooth riverstone beside it, as if in exchange. Their fascination with fire never waned. Each visit included the ritual of extracting burning sticks, waving them, watching the flames die. Sometimes they would rebuild the fire afterward. Other times they'd leave it dismantled. I never observed them attempting to create fire themselves, though they clearly understood its temporary nature. As October wore on into November, the temperature began to drop. The first snow dusted the higher elevations, and I knew my time in the area was growing short. Trappers can't afford to get snowbound, and I had my season's furs to transport back to the trading post before winter set in properly. On what I'd decided would be my final night, I left my fire burning brighter than usual and waited. The whistling came right on schedule, and all four creatures emerged from the trees. This time, however, something was different. They carried objects of their own: a bundle of unusual straight sticks, several strange-looking stone tools, and what appeared to be a crudely woven basket containing berries and nuts. They arranged these items near my fire in what felt like a deliberate display. Then, instead of their usual investigation of my camp, they simply stood in a semicircle, watching the flames. The largest one made a series of complex whistling sounds, unlike any I'd heard before. Were they saying goodbye? Did they somehow understand I was leaving? I'll never know for certain, but it felt significant. A moment of connection across an unbridgeable divide of understanding. After about 30 minutes, they collected their belongings and disappeared into the darkness. I never saw them again. The next morning, I broke camp and began my journey back to civilization. The winter was harsh that year, and by spring, logging operations had moved into the Trinity River Valley. By the time I returned the following autumn, the landscape had changed. Trees felled, new settlements established, the wilderness pushed back as it always is when man decides to conquer new territory. I never spoke of my experience to anyone until now. Who would believe the ravings of an old trapper claiming to have spent weeks observing creatures that science says don't exist? But I know what I saw. I know they were neither man nor any animal catalogued by naturalists. In my darker moments, I wonder if they survive somewhere in the shrinking wilderness. Those beings with their strange proportions and their fascination with fire, are they still out there, watching from the forests as their world grows smaller? Or were they the last of their kind, now gone like so many other creatures pushed aside by progress? I don't expect answers. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. But I swear on my life, what I've written here is the unvarnished truth. Those creatures on the Trinity River were real as the ground beneath my feet. And not a day goes by that I don't think about them and wonder. Story 13. I've never shared this story with many people. Most would think I'm crazy or making it all up for attention. But I swear on everything I hold dear, what happened that July day in 1884 changed my understanding of what's possible in this world. My name's Thomas, and I was 26 years old back then, working as a laborer on the railroad near Yale on Vancouver Island. It was back-breaking work, but the pay was decent enough to send money home to my mother and younger sister. We were a crew of about 15 men, led by our conductor R.J. Craig and engineer Ned Austin. Good men, both of them. Straight shooters who didn't tolerate nonsense. That July was unusually hot, the kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to you before you've even started working. We'd been digging out a tunnel for nearly 3 weeks, making slow progress through the rocky terrain. The mosquitoes were relentless, buzzing around our ears and biting any patch of exposed skin. The morning it happened started like any other. We arrived at the site just after dawn, around 5 o'clock. The air was already thick and humid. I remember taking a deep breath and tasting the earthy scent of the forest mixed with coal smoke from the nearby camp. Craig gathered us around for the daily briefing, pointing out areas that needed attention. Austin was fiddling with some machinery, cursing under his breath when something wouldn't cooperate. "Thomas," Craig called out, "take Johnson and Peters to the north section. That support beam looks questionable." I nodded, gathering my tools. The three of us made our way to the northern section of the tunnel, our lanterns casting long shadows against the rough-hewn walls. We had been working for maybe 2 hours when Johnson spotted something unusual in the rocky debris near the tunnel entrance. "Hey, come look at this," he said, pointing to what appeared to be strange footprints in the soft earth. They were roughly human-shaped but wider, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. "Probably just a bear," Peters said dismissively, though he didn't sound convinced. I crouched down to examine them closer. "Bears don't walk upright for this long," I said, gesturing to the trail that continued several yards. "And look at the stride length. Whatever made these is tall." A shout from outside interrupted our speculation. We rushed toward the commotion, emerging from the cool darkness of the tunnel into the blinding sunlight. Several of our crewmates were clustered near the supplies, pointing excitedly toward the tracks about 50 yards away. At first, I couldn't make out what they were seeing. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw it. A dark, furry figure sprawled across the tracks. "What in God's name is that?" Peters whispered beside me. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Craig pushed through the group, rifle in hand. "Stay back," he ordered, approaching cautiously. Austin followed behind him, carrying a length of heavy rope. 4 or 5 other workers moved forward as well, armed with shovels and pickaxes. I found myself joining them, heart hammering in my chest, curiosity overriding fear. As we got closer, I realized the creature was sleeping. Its chest rose and fell with slow, deep breaths. It was smaller than I expected, given those footprints, maybe 5 feet tall, but powerfully built, and it was covered head to toe in thick, dark hair about 1 inch long. "Is it a bear?" someone whispered. "Bears don't have arms and legs like that," Austin replied quietly. He was right. Despite its small stature, the creature had a distinctly humanoid shape. Arms, legs, a head, hands with fingers. But those hands, they were massive compared to its body, with long fingers ending in thick, dirty nails. The hair covering its body was coarse-looking, almost like a wild dog's. But its face, God, its face was almost human, despite being covered in the same dark hair. The nose was flat and wide, the jaw prominent. Craig gestured for us to surround it. "When I give the word, we'll throw the ropes over it and secure it before it wakes up." We positioned ourselves in a circle, every man tense and ready. I was directly across from Austin, who held the main length of rope. Craig raised his hand, then brought it down sharply. Everything happened at once. Austin threw his rope across the creature, and 2 other men lunged forward with their sections. The creature's eyes snapped open, dark, intelligent eyes that locked instantly with mine. A sound came from its throat, not quite a growl, not quite a yell, something in between that made the hair on my neck stand up. It moved with shocking speed, leaping to its feet despite the ropes. Peters was closest, and the creature shoved him with such force that he flew backward a good 10 feet. Johnson swung a shovel at it, connecting with its shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. The creature made a break for the trees, but more of us had arrived by now. We managed to encircle it, though no one wanted to get too close after seeing what happened to Peters. It spun around, searching for an escape, making short, huffing noises that sounded almost like frustrated words. What happened next still amazes me to this day. Craig, ever the quick thinker, pulled out his sandwich from his lunch pail and slowly extended his hand. The creature froze, its nostrils flaring. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then cautiously, it approached Craig, eyes never leaving the food. As it reached for the sandwich, Austin and 2 others threw additional ropes around it from behind. The creature roared, there's no other word for it, and struggled violently. It took 8 grown men to finally subdue it, and even then, it nearly broke free twice. Its strength was unbelievable for something its size. Once we had it properly restrained, we could examine it more closely. I'll never forget the moment it looked directly at me. There was intelligence there, not animal curiosity, but something deeper, something unsettlingly human. Yet it clearly wasn't human, at least not like any human I'd ever seen. "What do we do with it?" someone asked. Craig scratched his beard thoughtfully. "We could alert the authorities, but..." He trailed off, and I knew what he was thinking. This was something special, something potentially valuable. "We should name it," Johnson suggested, having recovered from his initial fear and now approaching our captive with cautious fascination. "Jacko," said Austin suddenly. "Let's call him Jacko." The name stuck immediately. Jacko. It somehow fit the creature, which had calmed somewhat but still watched us with those intense eyes. We constructed a makeshift cage using timber from our supplies and reinforced it with the metal tools and rope we had available. Getting Jacko into it was another challenge altogether. It took 6 men, several minor injuries, and nearly an hour of struggling. The creature's forearms were notably longer than a human's, giving it exceptional reach that caught us off guard more than once. Once secured, we took turns watching over our peculiar prisoner while Craig and Austin discussed what to do next. I volunteered for the first watch, drawn by an inexplicable fascination with Jacko. I sat on a stump, about 10 feet from the cage, watching as Jacko explored his confinement. His movements were deliberate and precise. He tested each bar, each knot in the rope, seemingly assessing the craftsmanship. Occasionally, he would look up at me, and I swear he was evaluating me just as thoroughly. "What are you?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. Jacko tilted his head, those dark eyes boring into mine. He made a soft sound in his throat, almost like he was trying to respond. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of hardtack. Jacko's attention immediately fixed on the food. When I tossed it through the bars, he snatched it from the air with startling speed. His hands were fascinating. While completely covered in hair on the backs, the palms were bare, pink skin visible as he examined the food before eating it. Word of our unusual captive spread quickly. By midday, workers from neighboring sites had come to see Jacko for themselves. Some suggested he might be some kind of ape that had escaped from a traveling circus, but I'd seen drawings of gorillas and chimpanzees in books. Jacko was neither of those. His proportions were wrong, his features too different. "It's a Sasquatch," one of the older workers declared with absolute certainty. He was a local man who had lived in these mountains his entire life. The native people have stories about them going back generations, wild men of the woods. Most of the crew scoffed at this, but looking at Jacko, I wasn't so quick to dismiss the idea. As the day progressed, Craig returned with news. He'd sent a telegram to a man named George K. Tilbury, a traveling showman he knew who specialized in exotic attractions. Tilbury had expressed immediate interest and was already on his way to view our capture. "How much did he offer?" Austin asked bluntly. Craig named a figure that made every man present stand a little straighter. Split among the crew, it would be more than 3 months' wages for each of us. While we waited for Tilbury's arrival, Jacko became increasingly restless. He would pace his cage, staring into the surrounding forest, occasionally making low, mournful sounds that made my skin crawl. Twice he tested the bars with his full strength, and the entire structure groaned ominously. We reinforced it with additional materials from the work site. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed something odd. Jacko had stopped pacing and was sitting perfectly still, facing the dense forest to the north. His posture was alert, head cocked slightly as if listening. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual among the towering pines and thick undergrowth. "What do you see, Jacko?" I murmured. As if in response, a distant sound reached us. Something between a howl and a call, echoing among the trees. The hair on my arm stood up. Jacko responded immediately, letting out a similar cry that was much louder up close. The power in his voice was astonishing. "Shut that thing up!" Craig shouted from where he and Austin were discussing logistics. I approached the cage cautiously. "Hey now, quiet down," I said, not knowing if Jacko could understand me, but hoping my tone would convey the message. Jacko turned to me, and I swear there was something like desperation in those eyes. He gestured toward the forest with one massive hand, then beat his chest twice before pointing again. The intelligence behind the action was unmistakable. He was trying to communicate. The realization sent a chill through me. This wasn't just some animal. Whatever Jacko was, he was thinking, reasoning, attempting to convey something important. Another call came from the forest, closer this time. Several of the men reached for their tools, suddenly uneasy. "You think there are more of them out there?" Johnson asked, voicing what we were all wondering. "Don't be ridiculous," Craig said firmly, but his hand rested on his holstered pistol. "It's probably just wolves." That didn't sound like any wolf I'd ever heard, but I kept the thought to myself. As sunset approached, a cloud of unease had settled over our camp. Jacko had grown increasingly agitated, rattling his cage with surprising force. It took 3 men to keep watch now, as we were genuinely concerned. he might break free. Tilbury arrived just as the light was fading, accompanied by 2 assistants. He was a corpulent man with a waxed mustache and the flashy attire of someone accustomed to performing for crowds. His eyes lit up when he saw Jacko, and I immediately disliked him for the greedy calculation in his gaze. "Extraordinary," he breathed, circling the cage. "Absolutely extraordinary. Not a gorilla, certainly not a chimpanzee. Something altogether different." Jacko watched Tilbury with what I could only describe as contempt, baring his teeth whenever the showman came too close. "He doesn't seem to like you," I observed. Tilbury laughed. "Animals seldom take to me immediately, but they learn." There was something sinister in the way he said it that made my stomach turn. Craig and Tilbury stepped aside to conclude their business. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and just like that, Jacko's fate was sealed. Tilbury proudly announced he would be taking the creature to England, where he had connections with various exhibitions and scientific societies. "He'll make us all famous, gentlemen," Tilbury proclaimed. "The mysterious wild man of Vancouver Island." As Tilbury's assistants prepared to transfer Jacko to their more substantial traveling cage, I felt an inexplicable sense of shame. What right did we have to capture this being and sell him like property? The thought had barely formed when more calls echoed from the forest. 3 distinct voices, much closer than before. Jacko responded with a series of rapid vocalizations that sounded almost like language. The rhythm and variation were too complex to be random animal sounds. "Hurry up with that transfer!" Tilbury snapped at his men, clearly unnerved by the calls. Night had fallen completely now, the worksite illuminated only by our lanterns. Shadows danced at the edge of the forest. More than once, I thought I saw movement among the trees, tall figures, quickly withdrawing when the light shifted their way. The transfer of Jacko to the new cage was chaotic. The moment the door to our makeshift prison opened, he exploded into action, breaking free from the 2 men holding the restraint ropes. He didn't run, though. Instead, he charged directly at Tilbury, moving with shocking speed. The showman screamed and stumbled backward, falling heavily to the ground. Jacko stood over him, not attacking, but making a series of sounds that seemed admonishing, almost like he was speaking. Then he looked directly at me, held my gaze for one intense moment, and bounded toward the forest. Gunshots rang out as Craig fired his pistol, but in the confusion and darkness, he missed. Jacko disappeared into the trees. "After him!" Tilbury shouted, his face red with rage. "That creature is worth a fortune." Several men grabbed lanterns and ran in pursuit, but I hung back, oddly relieved that Jacko had escaped. What happened next, I've replayed in my mind countless times over the years. From the darkness came sounds of struggle, shouting, then abrupt silence. We waited tensely, lanterns held high, straining to see into the pitch-black forest. After 10 minutes, Johnson and Peters emerged, pale-faced and breathless. "The others?" Craig demanded. Johnson shook his head. "Gone. We got separated in the dark. Then we heard—" He trailed off, looking to Peters. "Screaming," Peters finished. "Not human screaming, and not just from Jacko. There were others, bigger from the sound of it. We ran." A heavy silence fell over the camp. No one suggested going deeper into the forest to search for our missing comrades. Tilbury was beside himself, alternating between threats of legal action and demands that we organize a proper hunt at dawn. Craig eventually agreed to the latter, though I could tell his heart wasn't in it. None of us slept that night. We maintained a watch, keeping the fires burning high. Occasionally we would hear distant calls from the forest, moving steadily farther away. At first light, the missing men stumbled back into camp, disheveled but unharmed. Their stories were confused and contradictory. One claimed to have been picked up and carried for a distance before being gently set down. Another said he'd been surrounded by tall shapes that communicated with clicks and whistles. A third remembered nothing after being separated from the group. We organized search parties as promised, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that Jacko or any others like him had ever existed. It was as if the forest had swallowed them completely. Tilbury left empty-handed and furious, threatening lawsuits that never materialized. The incident was reported in some local papers, causing a brief stir, but without Jacko to display, interest quickly faded. The railroad company transferred most of us to different projects. I suspect they wanted to separate the witnesses, minimize the story's spread. Within a month, our crew had been scattered across 3 provinces. I've thought about Jacko nearly every day since. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those intelligent eyes looking into mine, the deliberate way he tried to communicate, the calls from the forest that came to rescue him. I'm an old man now, and I've never told this story publicly before, but I need someone to know the truth. There are things in this world that defy our understanding. Jacko was real, and I believe his family came for him that night. I still work outdoors when I can, mostly as a guide for hunting parties these days. Sometimes, deep in the wilderness, I'll hear a distant call echoing among the trees, and I'll wonder if it's Jacko, still out there with his kind, watching us from the shadows of the forest. Story 14. I've been turning this over in my head for 40-odd years now, and I still don't know rightly what to make of it. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat thinking about those eyes looking back at me. I ain't much for telling tales. Most folks around Happy Camp know me as a straight shooter. Jack Dover don't lie, that's what they say. But what I seen that summer of 1886 has haunted me something fierce. I was 32 back then, making my living mostly by hunting and trapping in the mountains around Siskiyou County. Good country if you know it well. Bad country if you don't. I'd built myself a decent reputation as a guide, too, taking prospectors and the occasional photographer up into the hills. That particular day, July 16th, if memory serves, I was checking some traps I'd set near the huckleberry patches on the western slope of Marble Mountain. It was unseasonably warm that year. The berries had come in early and thick. Black bears were having themselves a feast, which meant I had to be extra careful. Nothing worse than surprising a bear with its snout full of berries. I carried my Winchester rifle, like always, not just for bears, but for putting meat in the pot when the opportunity arose. I remember it was mid-afternoon when I came to this clearing I knew well. Good spot for huckleberries and thimbleberries both. The sun was high enough to warm my shoulders through my flannel shirt, but the air still had that mountain coolness to it. Birds were singing, insects buzzing, normal as anything. Then all of a sudden everything went quiet. You spend enough time in the wilderness, you learn to notice when the forest goes silent. Usually means something big is moving through, a bear, maybe a mountain lion. I froze where I stood, my hand tightening on my rifle. And that's when I saw it. About 150 yards away, something was moving among the berry bushes. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing up on its hind legs. But even from that distance, something wasn't right about the shape. It was tall, real tall, 7 feet at least, maybe more. And it wasn't moving like any bear I'd ever seen. I crouched down slow behind a fallen log and watched. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was picking berries. Not clawing them down like a bear would, but plucking them careful-like with its hands. Between picking berries, it would pull tender shoots from the bushes and eat those too. I'd heard stories, of course. Every man who spends time in these mountains has heard tales of wild men or mountain devils, as some of the old-timers called them. The local Indians have their legends too, but I never put much stock in such talk. Ghost stories for scaring children or entertaining folks around a campfire, I always thought. But what I was looking at wasn't no bear, nor any animal I recognized. And it sure as hell wasn't a man, at least not any kind of man I'd ever encountered. I raised my rifle to get a better look through the sight. That's when I got my first clear view of its face. Lord help me, I still see that face in my dreams sometimes. It had a rounded head covered in dark hair, with shorter hair on its face, like a beard, I suppose you could call it. Its ears were small, much smaller than a bear's, and set close to its head. The thing that struck me most was how, I don't know how to put it except to say it looked almost human in some ways, but wild in others. I had a clean shot. Could have squeezed that trigger and brought it down right there, but something stopped me. I've killed plenty in my time. Deer, elk, bear, mountain lion, never hesitated when meat was needed or danger was present, but looking at this creature through my rifle sight, I couldn't do it. It looked too human somehow. Not that it was a man, it wasn't, but there was something in its eyes, in the way it moved, that made my finger freeze on the trigger. I lowered my rifle and just watched. Must have been observing it for a good 15 minutes. The creature was methodical, moving from bush to bush, picking berries and eating. Occasionally it would look up, scanning the forest, alert like any wild thing, but it didn't seem to notice me yet. Then I got stupid. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to try and get closer. I moved from behind my log, staying low, trying to work my way around to a cluster of rocks about 50 yards closer. I was being careful, or thought I was, moving slow and quiet like I would when stalking elk. But I wasn't dealing with elk. I stepped on a dry branch, and the crack seemed to echo through the silent forest like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped up, looking in my direction. For just a second, couldn't have been more than that, our eyes met across that distance. I felt a chill run down my spine, unlike anything I'd ever felt before or since. Then it made a sound I'll never forget till my dying day. A high-pitched call that sounded for all the world like a woman in terrible fear. Not a scream exactly, but a sort of wailing cry, high and clear, echoing off the mountainside. The sound froze the blood in my veins. Before I could even think to raise my rifle again, the creature turned and moved into the dense forest at the edge of the clearing. I say moved because it wasn't exactly running like a man would run. It was more fluid-like, covering ground faster than seems possible for something that size. Within seconds, it was gone, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. I stood there shaking, still hearing that eerie cry echoing in my head. Part of me wanted to follow, to see where it went, to prove to myself that I'd really seen what I thought I'd seen. But another part, the smarter part I reckon, kept my feet rooted to that spot. Some things in this world ain't meant to be followed. By the time I got back to Happy Camp that evening, I was half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the sun had got to me, or I'd eaten some bad jerky, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real, as the ground beneath my feet. I didn't tell anyone at first. In a small place like Happy Camp, a man gets a reputation as a liar or a drunk. It sticks to him like pine sap. But 3 days later, Tom Watkins came into the general store while I was there, white as a sheet, talking about seeing a hair-covered giant near his cabin up Elk Creek Way. Said it had been in his garden, pulling up some of his vegetables. That's when I finally spoke up, told what I'd seen. Soon enough, others started coming forward with their own stories. Jasper Collins had found strange footprints, big as a bear's but shaped like a man's, around the wild blackberry patch behind his property. Martha Wheeler swore something had been picking the berries from the bushes outside her kitchen window at night. Within a week, half the town was talking about what folks started calling the Berry Man. Some were scared, wanting to organize hunting parties to track it down. Others, mostly the older settlers who'd lived alongside the local Indians, had a different view. Old Man Jenkins suggested leaving out food offerings, like the natives used to do. Keeps them from getting hungry enough to raid your stores, he said. I don't know if it was superstition or good sense, but several families started leaving small bundles of food, dried meat, fruit, sometimes bread, at the edges of their properties, and sure enough, the food would disappear overnight, and their gardens and berry patches would remain untouched. As for me, I went back to that clearing several times over the next few weeks. Never saw the creature again, though twice I found tracks, enormous footprints pressed into the soft earth, with 5 toes clear as day. Not bear tracks, not human tracks, but something in between. The last time I went looking was in early September. Summer was fading and the berry bushes were mostly picked clean. I sat on that same fallen log where I'd first spotted the creature and just listened to the forest. As dusk fell, I heard that sound again, that high, keening call echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. Sounded farther away this time, moving up into the higher country as the season changed. I never went looking after that. Whatever the berryman was, it had its place in these mountains, same as the bears and the cougars and all the other wild things. Some of the younger men in town still talk about hunting it down whenever the subject comes up. But their enthusiasm always fades when I ask them a simple question. What would you do if you found it? Because that's the thing that's troubled me all these years. When I had that creature in my sights, I couldn't pull the trigger. Couldn't bring myself to kill something that seemed to be just going about its business, harming no one, gathering food like any of God's creatures. In its eyes, I saw something I wasn't expecting. Not just wildness, but intelligence, awareness. The stories have died down over the years. New folks move in, old-timers pass on, and tales get dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. But every summer when the berries ripen, I notice some of the older families still leave little bundles of food at the forest edge. And if you ask them why, they'll just shrug and say it's tradition. As for me, I've never told the full story to anyone outside Happy Camp. Who'd believe it? A 7-foot, hairy creature with a woman's voice picking berries in the California wilderness. I'd be laughed out of any respectable establishment from here to Sacramento. But I know what I saw that day on Marble Mountain, and so do a handful of others who've had their own encounters. I'm an old man now, and I've seen a lot of changes come to this country. Forests cut down, mountains tunneled through, rivers dammed up. Sometimes I wonder if there's any wild places left where a creature like the berryman could still roam undisturbed. I hope so. Because, despite the fear I felt that day, there was something else too, a kind of wonder at knowing the world is still big enough, still mysterious enough to harbor things beyond our understanding. Last summer, my grandson took me fishing up near Marble Mountain. My legs aren't what they used to be, so I sat by the creek while he went exploring. When he came back, he was quiet, thoughtful-like. It took some coaxing, but he finally told me he'd found some strange tracks by a huckleberry patch. Bigger than any man's footprint, he said. I just nodded and told him some places in these mountains are special, that they belong to creatures that were here long before us. I didn't tell him my story. Maybe someday I will, or maybe it's better to let him discover the mysteries of these mountains on his own, the way I did all those years ago. Some knowledge changes a person, makes them see the world differently. Once you've looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist but does, you never quite see the forest the same way again. All I know for certain is what I saw that July afternoon in 1886. I saw something that didn't fit into my understanding of what's possible. And even now, when I hear that high, lonely call echoing down from the mountains on summer evenings, I don't reach for my rifle anymore. Instead, I leave a small bundle on my porch. Dried apples and berries, maybe some jerky, and in the morning, it's always gone. Story 15. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. My grandfather passed away last spring at the age of 94, and among his belongings, I found his journal. What I read there has haunted me ever since. It's taken months for me to build up the courage to write this down, but I need to tell someone. I can't keep carrying this alone. My grandfather was born in 1928 in a small logging town near the Chetco River in Curry County, Oregon. His father, my great-grandfather, had been the county sheriff from 1888 until 1902. The journal contained mostly mundane details about his life, but tucked between the pages was a separate set of papers. My great-grandfather's private account of an investigation from 1890 that was never officially resolved. I'm going to transcribe what he wrote, almost word for word. Some of the language is old-fashioned, but I'll try to stay true to his account. This has been kept in our family for over a century, and now I'm breaking that silence. I think people deserve to know what really happened out there. April 18th, 1890. It was just after dawn when Billy Masterson came pounding on my door, face white as a sheet. Billy's a logger who was working a new claim about 8 miles upriver. He told me his crew had found 2 bodies while clearing a path to a stand of old-growth redwoods. The bodies were in bad shape, worse than anything he'd ever seen. I grabbed my coat and revolver, then rode out with Billy and Dr. Patterson. The ride took nearly 2 hours on horseback. The whole way, Billy kept saying things that didn't make sense, about how the men had been broken and folded wrong. I assumed he was exaggerating from shock, but I was wrong. We arrived at a small clearing about a quarter mile from the logging camp. The foreman, Hank Miller, was keeping everyone away from the site. When I saw what they'd found, I understood why. 2 men, dressed as trappers, were lying about 15 feet apart. Their bodies... Christ, I don't even know how to describe it. They'd been mangled in ways that didn't seem possible. One man's back was bent completely backward, like someone had folded him in half the wrong way. The other's limbs were twisted at impossible angles, bones protruding through the skin. Both had massive trauma to their skulls and torsos, consistent with being picked up and slammed repeatedly against the ground or possibly the nearby trees. Dr. Patterson said he'd never seen injuries like this, even in the worst industrial accidents. The force required to do this kind of damage was beyond human capability. A bear could potentially inflict some of these injuries, but the pattern was all wrong. Bears maul and tear. They don't pick up grown men and slam them into the ground until their bones shatter. We found both men's rifles nearby. One was bent, actually bent like a branch, and the other had its stock splintered. Several spent cartridges were scattered in a rough semicircle, suggesting they'd been firing at something approaching from the tree line. Whatever they were shooting at, they apparently didn't hit it, or if they did, it didn't stop coming. Neither man carried any identification. They had the usual trapper's gear, knives, some snares, a few pelts already collected. One had a partial name scratched into his belt, L. Hem, with the rest worn away. The other had nothing to identify him at all. Their boots were good quality, and their clothes, while dirty and worn, were better than what most drifters wear. They weren't local, I'm sure of that. I know every trapper who works these woods. I ordered the bodies to be wrapped and brought back to town. While the men were doing that, I searched the surrounding area. That's when I found the tracks. At first, I thought they were bear prints, but something was off. They were too narrow, too long. The stride between them was enormous, at least 4 feet. And they were clearly made by something walking on 2 legs, not 4. I've hunted every animal in these woods since I was a boy, and I've never seen tracks like these. They were at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested whatever made them was extraordinarily heavy. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward territory that even most of the loggers avoid. The locals call it Dead Man's Reach, a stretch of old-growth forest that runs along the river for about 3 miles. The Tututni people who used to live in this area before the reservation system wouldn't go near it. They called it the place of the strong ones. I followed the tracks for about half a mile before they disappeared where the ground turned to stone. By then it was getting late, and I wasn't about to be caught in those woods after dark, not after what I'd seen. When we got back to town, I sent telegrams to neighboring counties asking if anyone had reported 2 trappers missing. I also wrote to the state capital requesting any information on similar attacks. The bodies were laid out in Patterson's back room for examination, and I posted guards, though I'm not sure why. It just felt necessary. That night, Jacob Whiteclaw came to see me. Jacob's one of the few Tututni who still lives off reservation, having married a white woman and taken up blacksmithing in town. We've known each other since we were boys, but I'd never seen him look so grave. "You found them in Dead Man's Reach," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded and offered him a chair, which he declined. "My grandfather told me stories about that place," he said. "The strong ones live there. They've been there since before our people came to these lands. They keep to themselves unless their territory is invaded." "You're talking about legends, Jacob," I said. "I need facts. 2 men are dead." I'll never forget the look he gave me. "My people have lived with these facts for centuries, Thomas. Your people choose not to see." He told me that every 20 or 30 years, the strong ones become more aggressive, defending their territory with increased vigor. According to tribal history, this happens when too many outsiders enter their domain or when their numbers grow. The last time had been in the 1860s, when 3 members of a survey crew disappeared in the same area. I asked him to describe these strong ones. He said they were tall, taller than any man, covered in thick hair, with strength beyond anything human. They could break a man as easily as I might snap a twig. They were intelligent and used tools, but they weren't men. They were something else, something that belonged to this land. Obviously, I couldn't put "murdered by legendary forest creatures" in my official report, but I've known Jacob all my life. He's not a man given to fantasy or exaggeration, and those tracks. April 19th, 1890. Dr. Patterson completed his examination of the bodies this morning. His findings were disturbing, to say the least. Both men had been dead less than 24 hours when found. The cause of death was massive trauma, but the nature of the injuries revealed something horrifying. Patterson believes both men were picked up bodily and slammed repeatedly against hard surfaces. The pattern of broken bones suggested they had been swung by their legs or arms. The force required would be immense, far beyond human capability. More troubling was what Patterson found in one of the men's hands. Clutched in his death grip were several coarse reddish-brown hairs, far too thick to be human, but unlike any animal fur Patterson had ever seen. I've preserved these as evidence, though I'm not sure what they prove. Mid-morning, I received responses to my telegrams. No neighboring counties reported missing trappers. The state capital had no records of similar attacks, but they did mention an unresolved incident from 1862 involving the disappearance of 3 government surveyors in our county. Their equipment was found scattered through the woods, but their bodies were never recovered. I spent the afternoon interviewing loggers who'd been working near where the bodies were found. 3 of them reported hearing strange vocalizations in the weeks leading up to the deaths, sounds they described as not quite human, not quite animal, high-pitched whistles followed by deep, guttural roars. They'd also found trees snapped in half at heights no man could reach, and rocks stacked in formations that seemed deliberate but served no apparent purpose. One man, Edwin Porter, told me something that chilled my blood. 2 nights before the bodies were discovered, he'd been walking back to camp after checking trap lines when he felt like he was being watched. He turned and saw what he thought was a man standing at the tree line. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized whatever it was stood over 7 feet tall and was covered in hair. When it realized it had been spotted, the figure let out a sound like a woman screaming, but deeper, angrier, and melted back into the forest. Porter fired a warning shot and ran back to camp. He told his companions, but they dismissed it as nerves or a trick of the fading light. After recording these testimonies, I decided to return to the site where the bodies were found. This time, I brought Jacob with me, along with 2 deputies. Jacob was reluctant, but agreed out of respect for our friendship. The clearing looked different in the bright light of midday, less sinister, but no less troubling. The ground was still stained with blood. The deputies and I searched the area more thoroughly, finding more spent cartridges and signs of a desperate struggle. The men had clearly tried to escape, running in different directions before being caught and killed. While we did this, Jacob stood at the edge of the clearing, studying the tree line. After about an hour, he called me over, his voice tense. "We're being watched," he whispered. I scanned the dense forest, but saw nothing. "Are you sure?" I asked. Jacob nodded. "There's more than one. They're curious about why we've returned." I ordered the deputies to ready their rifles, and we formed a tight group, backs together facing outward. That's when we heard it, a high, piercing whistle from the north, answered by a similar call from the south. They were communicating, coordinating, then the rock came flying out of the trees, not thrown, hurled with such force that it embedded itself in a tree trunk not 5 feet from where I stood. It was a warning. "We need to leave," Jacob said. "Now. They're telling us this is our only chance." We didn't argue. We mounted our horses and rode hard for 2 miles before slowing to a trot. The entire time, I had the unshakable feeling we were being followed, paced from just inside the tree line. When we reached the main road, Jacob finally spoke. "The strong ones didn't kill those trappers without reason. Your men must have violated some boundary, threatened them somehow." "They were just setting traps," I said. Jacob shook his head. "Look deeper, Thomas. The strong ones don't attack without provocation." Back in town, I examined the trappers' belongings more carefully. Among their gear, I found something I'd missed before, a crude map drawn on a piece of tanned hide. It showed the river and surrounding terrain, with several X marks in the area known as Dead Man's Reach. One area was circled with the words "Big Tracks, Follow" written beside it. These weren't just random trappers. They were hunting something specific. They were hunting the strong ones. April 20th, 1890. This morning, I was summoned to the lumber mill on the edge of town. Overnight, something had damaged several pieces of heavy equipment. Metal parts were bent or crushed, and deep scratches were gouged into wooden beams. The night watchman claimed to have seen nothing, but admitted to hearing strange noises around midnight and being too frightened to investigate. Fresh tracks, the same unusual, oversized footprints, were found around the damaged equipment. But this time, there was something else. A deliberate arrangement of broken tools formed into what could only be described as a warning symbol. Jacob confirmed it resembled markings the Tututni used to warn of dangerous areas. They had followed us back to town. I called an emergency meeting of the town council that afternoon. I presented the evidence as objectively as possible, the nature of the trappers' injuries, the tracks, the damaged equipment, the testimonies. I even showed them the strange hairs found in the dead man's grip. The reactions were what I expected. Some men laughed nervously, others grew angry, accusing me of entertaining Indian superstitions. Reverend Hollis suggested demonic activity and proposed a prayer vigil. Only the older members, those who had lived in the area the longest, remained silent, exchanging knowing glances. Mayor Williams finally spoke. "Sheriff, I respect your thoroughness, but we can't tell people that some forest monsters killed those men. The official report needs to reflect a reasonable explanation." "And what would that be?" I asked. "A bear attack," he said firmly. 2 trappers surprised a bear, possibly near cubs, and paid the price. The equipment damage is likely vandals or disgruntled workers. I started to protest, but Williams raised his hand. "Thomas, think about what you're suggesting. Think about the panic it would cause. Think about what the papers in Portland would say. Oregon town claims wildman killing trappers. We'd be a laughing stock, and worse, the logging companies would pull out. This town survives on timber." He was right about one thing. No one would believe the truth. So I agreed to file the official report as a bear attack while continuing my private investigation. That evening, Jacob came to my office with his oldest uncle, a man named Grey Wolf, who rarely came to town. Grey Wolf was old enough to remember the time before the reservation, when the Tututni controlled much of this territory. He spoke little English, so Jacob translated. Grey Wolf had been a young man during the last time of aggression in the 1860s. According to him, the Strong Ones had a cycle of territory enforcement that coincided with their breeding periods. During these times, they would actively drive away any humans who ventured too close to their core territories. But there was more to it this time. Grey Wolf believed the dead trappers had been actively hunting the Strong Ones, perhaps seeking to capture or kill one. This would explain the extraordinary violence of the attack. It wasn't just territorial defense, but retaliation. I asked how we could prevent further incidents. Grey Wolf's answer was simple: stay out of Dead Man's reach entirely for at least a full moon cycle, and publicly announce the area as off-limits due to dangerous bear activity. This would save face while respecting the territorial boundaries. Grey Wolf also insisted that any logging operations near the boundary be temporarily halted. This would be harder to justify, but I promised to try. As they were leaving, Grey Wolf gripped my arm with surprising strength and said something to Jacob in their language. Jacob looked troubled as he translated. He says the Strong Ones know where you live now. They remember faces. Don't go into the woods alone again, not even near town. April 21st, 1890. I convinced Mayor Williams to declare Dead Man's Reach off-limits due to aggressive bear activity following the tragic deaths of 2 trappers. Most people accepted this explanation readily enough. No one wants to believe there's something in those woods that can't be explained. The logging company was less cooperative. They agreed to a 2-week pause on operations near the boundary, but insisted they couldn't afford longer without compensation. I made a personal appeal to the foreman, showing him photographs of the trappers' broken bodies. That convinced him, though he claimed it only proved how dangerous bears could be. I buried the trappers today in unmarked graves, as no one came forward to claim them. Reverend Hollis said a few words, and life in town began returning to normal. The story was already fading from people's minds, becoming just another cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness. But I can't forget what I saw. I can't unsee those tracks, the deliberate way the equipment was damaged, the intelligence behind the warning symbols. Whatever killed those men, it wasn't a bear. Tonight, as I was locking up the office, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. Across the street, at the edge of town where the forest begins, I saw movement. Just for a second, in the gathering darkness, a figure taller than any man, standing motionless between 2 trees. When I blinked, it was gone. I'm writing this at my desk, my revolver loaded beside me. I don't know if what Jacob's uncle said is true, that they remember faces, that they know where I live. But I'm not taking chances. I've sent Martha and the children to stay with her sister in Portland for a few weeks. Tomorrow, I'll ride out to the boundary again, this time alone. Not to hunt or challenge, but to understand. There's something out there, something that's been there far longer than our town, our laws, our understanding of what's possible. If we're going to coexist, someone needs to try and bridge that gap. If I don't return, well, this journal will explain why. That's where my great-grandfather's account ends. According to my grandfather, Thomas Callahan did return from his ride to the boundary that day, but he never spoke about what happened there. The official record still lists the trappers' deaths as a bear attack. The logging operation in Dead Man's Reach was eventually abandoned after multiple equipment failures and accidents, officially attributed to the difficult terrain. My grandfather told me that his father never went into those woods again, not even on official business. He would send deputies instead. And until the day he died, Thomas Callahan kept his bedroom window closed and locked. even during the hottest summer nights. I've researched the area since finding this journal. Dead Man's Reach still exists on old maps, though it's called something else now. It's part of a protected wilderness area where logging has never been permitted. According to local history, there have been at least 6 disappearances in that area since 1890, all officially attributed to accidents or exposure. Last month, I drove out there, intending to hike to the approximate location where the trappers were found. I made it about 2 miles in before the feeling of being watched became so overwhelming that I turned back. As I reached my car, I heard it, a high, piercing whistle from deep in the forest, followed by a deeper call from another direction. I won't be going back. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some territories aren't ours to claim. The strong ones were here before us, and they'll likely be here long after we're gone. All they ask is that we respect their space. After reading my great-grandfather's account, I think that's the least we can do.